Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
The surgery department was in the usual early week bustle. Some patients were being discharged, others, on the contrary, were arriving. The nurse at the post formalized new arrivals. Doctors were carrying out initial examinations, drawing up appointment sheets, and only the office of the head was quiet. But only silence had its own special meaning. The head of the ward had set up a very strange machine on his desk, the sight of which gave Amanda Swan, the nurse, a strange sense of unease. "Mr. Andrew Brown, what is this?" she asked quietly. "What is it?" "A polygraph, Swan. What else is it?" "You don't want to tell the truth. I don't have time to wait for you to confess. We're going to hook up all the wires and find out what's what," said the doctor. The nurse shuddered. "But it's probably illegal. And you need my consent, isn't it?" Mr. Andrew Brown raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Consent? Don't you agree? When I took the patient's bracelet, I didn't ask for consent." "I didn't. That's not true. Why would I do that? My job is more important to me," Amanda argued vehemently. But the superintendent was not at all convinced by her tirade. Not only that, he gently sat her down on a chair and began attaching sensors to her body. The sticky suction cups against her skin made Amanda uncomfortable. "My God, what is this?" she thought. She was being accused of stealing something she hadn't done. It's just unthinkable. Yes, Amanda grew up in an orphanage, but she'd never taken anything that wasn't hers. And what would she do with that bracelet? Meanwhile, Mr. Andrew Brown had finished his final preparations and was getting down to business. But to make the procedure look more or less legal, he invited Amanda's colleague, a nurse, as a witness. "Helen, is Swan willing to tell the truth or not?" He began with a routine screening question. "Agreed?" "I do," she answered timidly. At the same moment, there was a single, barely audible squeak, and the superintendent smiled. "Well, now you're telling the truth. So let's move on to the more difficult question. Did you take the bracelet from businessman Pattison?" Amanda looked fearfully at her boss. "No, of course not. I already told you that." The polygraph squeaked again. In a slightly different tone, though. Mr. Andrew Brown frowned. "Strange. This signal corresponds to neither yes nor no. What is that supposed to mean?" "Amanda must not have taken that bracelet," Helen helpfully suggested. "What about Mr. John Pattison saying that the bracelet disappeared as soon as Amanda entered his room?" the ward manager objected. "That's not true, Mr. Brown. It's a lie. There was a notary besides me. He came out after me when I was scrubbing the floor," Amanda exclaimed, and the polygraph beeped in agreement. The doctor, stunned, shook his head. "Wow, she's telling the truth. Technology, my arse." Amanda, realizing that there was no way to avoid further questioning, prepared for the worst. "So Swan, have you heard who Mr. John Pattison left everything to?" The superintendent persisted. She lowered her eyes. "I did, but I didn't do it on purpose. It's just that the notary insisted that the will be drawn up soon. Mr. John Pattison was in a bad way, so they started in front of me." Mr. Andrew Brown's eyes flashed strangely. "Who did it all go to, Swan?" "Don't be silent. The polygraph, is a delicate thing. It'll find out everything, and it'll get what it wants." Amanda frowned. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I have the right to divulge what I've heard. And as for the bracelet, I didn't take it." The polygraph confirmed her words again, which made the superintendent cringe like a toothache. "No, Swan. You took the bracelet. Tell me, did you hold it in your hand?" Amanda turned pale, realizing where the boss was going with this. "No, I did not." At that moment, the polygraph beeped in protest, which brought a smile to the superintendent's face. Now you're lying, Swan, and you're not blushing. No, I'm not. I picked it up, but not to steal it, the nurse tearfully exclaimed. But it was too late. Mr. Andrew Brown had taken the censors off her and, unashamed of Helen's presence, called her a thief. But it wasn't my fault. Amanda made excuses. Then the superintendent began to scold her to the full, threatening her with criminal prosecution and other troubles. Helen tactfully walked out at that moment. She didn't want to be present at such an unpleasant scene. After about 10 minutes, the anger of the head of the department began to subside. After he had calmed down a little, he said, "Anyway, Swan, you realize, after what's happened, there's no place for you in my ward. I know you've got a little baby and all that, but Mr. John Pattison's son, Matthew, he won't forgive this theft, especially since his father's operation was generally unsuccessful." Amanda stood with her head slumped. What could she say when she was accused of a heinous theft without proof? "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked wistfully. "Well, what to do? I'll get you a job, Swan. You'll have to go to the country for a while, of course. What else is there to do? Or you can return the bracelet and fall at the feet of those rich people. There's no other way. Do you realize that? And if you don't, you go to jail for robbery. The Pattisons don't take no offense." "Well, I don't have any bracelet," Amanda objected. But it didn't matter. The superintendent had already made up his mind. Why did she have to get her hands on it? "All right, Swan, I want you to go down to the accounts department and get that paperwork organized, and I'll give you the address to go to." The superintendent said goodbye, stroking the polygraph lovingly with the palm of his hand. Amanda nodded and walked out of the office. At that moment, she realized that her life would never be the same again. Everyone in the ward looked at the nurse as if she were a thief who had stolen an expensive bracelet from a patient, and this after she had worked here faithfully for 2 years. Tears came out of her eyes. In the billing department, everything went quickly. The cashier stamped her employment card with an impassive expression and pointed to the door. Amanda walked down the corridor as if in a dream. Helen, her partner, tried to stop her, to ask what was wrong, but Amanda just waved her away. She didn't want to talk to anyone right now, nor did she want to think about who was really to blame for the theft. When she stepped outside, she put her heated cheeks to the cool breeze and cried softly. Amanda walked home, clutching the bag of leftover lunch in her hand. As it happened, she was not going to be able to wait for lunch. Her heart was pounding in her chest like a bird in a cage. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving salty tracks on her shamefully burning skin. She still couldn't believe she'd been fired, and for such a flimsy excuse. Amanda was desperate. She loved her job, despite the hard physical work and constant stress. She walked down the street, trying to avoid passers-by as if they were involved in her accusation. The squeak of the polygraph and the phrase the superintendent had told her that morning, "You'll have to go to work in the province." What to do now? Fortunately, her son was waiting for her at home, the only happiness, a ray of light in this grim reality. Sam was only 7, but his cheerfulness and childlike spontaneity won over anyone who talked to him. Amanda, for her part, did her best to make sure that her son's smile never went out. She entered the flat, setting her purse and a bag of food on the floor. Sam was sitting at the table, diligently tracing some simple figure with a pencil. "Mom's here. I'm drawing a boat," the boy exclaimed with joy in his voice. Amanda sighed sadly and wiped her eyes with a handkerchief to hide her tears. Then she walked over to her son and hugged him, feeling his little arms around her neck. "What a clever boy you are," she said. Sam smiled and proudly showed his drawing. It was of a sailboat riding the stormy waves towards danger. Amanda struggled to squeeze out a smile, realizing that she needed to support her son in some way. But for some reason the words stuck in her throat, preventing her from saying the most important thing. How could she tell her son that his mom had been sacked and not only had been forced to pay up, but had also been accused of stealing something she hadn't committed? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Amanda cooked dinner, then watched TV with her son and put him to bed. Sam fell asleep quickly, not even aware of the impending trouble. It was understandable. A child. What could he do? Mrs. Swan sat in the kitchen chair for a long time, staring at the lights of the night city outside the window. She thought about her future life and the fact that she and Sam would soon have to move. In the pocket of her purse was a sheet of paper with the address Mr. Brown had given her. How would they be welcomed in their new place? What would await them? No one could tell. All through the night Amanda cried with her face buried in her pillow. Never before had she felt so helpless. The next day she got up at first light, feeling tired all over. She started preparing her son's breakfast, which consisted of an omelet and a couple of cheese sandwiches. Sam, as always, was optimistic and excited about the day ahead. At that moment the doorbell rang. Puzzled as to who it could be, Amanda went to open it. On the doorstep stood a woman dressed in characteristic formal attire. "Good morning, I'm Mrs. Emma Priestley, Chief Inspector of City Social Services," introduced herself. "Social Services?" Amanda stretched out uncertainly and let her in. "Quite right. You are Mrs. Amanda Swan, aren't you?" the inspector asked icily. She nodded dejectedly, realizing that nothing good was in store for her. She took Mrs. Priestley into the kitchen, poured her some tea, and set down a tin of sweets. The guest thanked her and then came to the point. "You see, Mrs. Swan, since you are a single mother and you lost your job yesterday, our organization couldn't overlook that fact. I came to see if you needed any help." Amanda shuddered, mentally surprised at how quickly the information was spreading. She had only been sacked yesterday, and this morning an inspector was already on her doorstep. Was that really possible? Could it be that Mrs. Priestley had been given the right address to encourage Amanda to take more action? Meanwhile, the guest continued. "Mrs. Swan, in principle, the fact of your dismissal is not particularly negative. But theft, that's a serious matter. Such an unpleasant fact can lead to irreversible consequences, such as, for example, the deprivation of your parental rights. And in this case, your son Sam will automatically go to boarding school. And at best, you'd only see him at weekends. What am I supposed to do?" Amanda exclaimed in despair. Mrs. Priestley shook her head. "What am I to do?" The answer to that question is quite simple. You have to find a new job, and as soon as possible. Otherwise, you will be subject to punitive measures. Only now did Amanda realize what her guest was getting at. Of course, the social services had been surprisingly clear and coordinated. Because of that, the whole town had learned about her dire situation. "I'll definitely get a job. And Sam and I are going to Pinewood Village. They need a nurse there." Amanda begged. "Pinewood, you say? That's commendable. We'll transfer your records to your new location." Mrs. Priestley made a note in her notebook and got up from her desk. Amanda realized that the conversation was over. She closed the door behind her and exhaled a sigh of relief. It had been an extremely difficult conversation after all, especially given what had happened to her yesterday, including the lie detector test and Mr. Brown's fuss. "Mum, are we going somewhere?" cautiously asked her son. Amanda turned round and looked at Sam in embarrassment. "Yes, we're leaving today. Please pack the toys and I'll take care of the suitcases." "Wow, it's a real trip. Is there a river or a forest in this village?" Sam asked hopefully. Amanda smiled. "Well, I don't know for sure, but I hope there is. They gave me this address just yesterday. They said they'd be waiting." Sam's eyes shone with joy, but Amanda didn't share that enthusiasm. To tell the truth, she still couldn't figure out who had set her up, who had stolen the bracelet from Pattison's room. Or maybe it all had something to do with the late rich man's will. After all, in fact, Amanda had heard his conversation with notary Nicholas Wilson. But is that really grounds for dismissal? This is weird. Packing her bags, Amanda briefly fell into anxious reflection. She returned her thoughts to the day when Mr. Pattison had first had the notary in his room, and remembered how uncomfortable John had felt. He was weak, and only his burning, tireless thirst for life gave away the strong and strong-willed man in him. Amanda tried to clean herself so as not to disturb the patient, remaining invisible to others. It was an art. After all, not everyone knows how to remain inconspicuous in plain sight. The door opened, and on the threshold appeared a guest whom the sick businessman was very much waiting for. The notary Nicholas Wilson was a rather tall man with a gray streak in his hair. Amanda remembered well the moment when he entered, holding a bulky leather folder. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pattison," said the notary, noticing how the businessman, despite his weakness, visibly perked up at his appearance. "Nicholas, thank you for coming," said the patient. The notary sighed sadly and sat down on a chair by the bed, trying not to take too long. "Mr. Pattison, I am ready to draw up all the necessary documents." "Have you already decided who will be your heir?" The businessman wrinkled his nose and tried to assume a more comfortable position in bed. At this moment, the visitor, accustomed to handling the affairs of the rich, suddenly felt that the matter was taking an unusual turn. "Nicholas, I've been building my business for many years, collecting and saving money like bees save honey. And you know what I realized? It's all a load of rubbish, not worth a man's attention." The notary raised his eyebrows in surprise. John Pattison, a man whose name was synonymous with success and prosperity, talks about the uselessness of money. At this point, having involuntarily heard the details of the conversation, Amanda even held her breath in surprise. "I have a son, Matthew, who is not a bad boy, but I wouldn't want him to inherit my assets," the businessman continued. "What do you mean you wouldn't want him to? Who would inherit the assets? To his wife, I hope?" Nicholas Wilson asked. Mr. Pattison sighed sadly and, as if addressing another, invisible interlocutor, added, "I'm tired of my son's family and antics, of his perpetual problems with the law. I'm tired of settling his problems with the police and paying for the repair of wrecked cars after accidents. You know, I don't have the energy for it. My wife Caroline is all over Matthew. He's not my own, he's my adopted son. So I want my fortune to go to help those who will really benefit from it: orphanages, homeless shelters." Nicholas Wilson, used to wealth being passed down from generation to generation, was shocked. In his years of extensive practice, he had never before encountered such a statement. "Mr. Pattison, this is a very responsible decision. Are you sure you don't want to leave the money to your son?" the notary asked. "I am sure. To Matthew, I would like to leave a good upbringing and a shake. I think it would serve him well," resolutely replied the sick man. Amanda nearly dropped the mop from her hands in surprise. Nicholas Wilson did not argue. "I understand and am ready to draw up all the necessary documents." At the same time, the notary realized that he was not just a rich businessman, but a man who had made a difficult choice that would probably change the fate of many. After the visitor had made the necessary edits to the will, Mr. Pattison said, "Nicholas, you and I are adults. We'll dispense with oaths and confessions, but please don't tell anyone about my decision. Let it be our secret." Nicholas Wilson nodded and involuntarily threw an anxious glance in Amanda's direction, but the businessman only waved his hand. "Come on, she's a lovely creature, a real cleanliness fairy. So don't look for problems where there are none." The notary nodded and began to fulfill his immediate duties. When Nicholas Wilson had finally finished drawing up the documents, he signed them and, holding out his hand to the businessman, said, "Mr. Pattison, very pleased that you have made this decision. I'm sure your financial assets will benefit those to whom they are addressed. And if you change your mind, I am always ready to help you and make any changes to your will." The patient shook his hand and closed his eyes. John felt that although he had met his illness face to face, there were still chances for a favorable outcome of the case, albeit small, but still. As it happened, Amanda had left the room a little before the notary, glancing at the bracelet that would soon play a cruel joke on her. And now, standing with two huge yellow suitcases in her hands, she still could not understand the motives of John Pattison, who had fallen into a coma after a botched operation. Couldn't he have left his son at least part of his business? And where had his bracelet disappeared to, which was the reason Amanda had been accused of stealing it in the first place? Sighing sadly, she looked round the walls of her rented flat one last time, and then went out to the stairwell with her son. There she gave her neighbor her keys and part of the rent for the last month. Behind Sam's back hung a funny backpack, from which the head of a teddy bear looked out. The boys saw the whole thing as an adventure. For Amanda, however, moving seemed to be something difficult and unpredictable. They decided to get to Orakovsky by bus, putting their bulky suitcases in the luggage. Amanda noticed with a smile that a young man had the exact same suitcase as theirs. Even the color was the same, yellow turning to orange. The cabin was stuffy. When the driver saw that Amanda was with child, he chose a better seat by the window, where he could get some fresh air. The sun, which was at its zenith, had already turned the bus into a red-hot furnace half an hour after the journey had started. Amanda looked longingly at the endless fields floating outside the window and felt sad. The yellow burnt grass was riddled with narrow paths that looked like the arteries of some huge creature. Sam sat next to her, staring at the screen of the smartphone his mother had bought him for his birthday. Amanda smiled, remembering the days when gadgets had never existed and people took books or magazines on their trips. Finally pulling away from the smartphone, Sam asked quietly, "Are there bears in the forest?" "I don't know, Sam. We are going to live in the village," Amanda replied. "What if a bear comes to the village?" his son persisted. "He won't come there. Calm down. Most of the time bears are afraid of human habitation and avoid it," replied Amanda. Meanwhile, the bus was traveling further and further away from the city. Fields, forests, and small bodies of water, which seemed like inverted saucers from outside, were passing by outside the window. The time on the road stretched very slowly. Finally, the bus slowed down smoothly and stopped next to an old, leaning on one side stop. "Oh, are we there?" Sam exclaimed and jumped up from his seat, following a couple of passengers who were hurrying to get out of the stuffy cabin. Amanda followed her son, unwittingly bumping the shoulder of the passenger, with whom she shared the same suitcase. The man smiled and nodded understandingly. "That's okay, it's fine." By the time Amanda got off the bus, the driver had already set her suitcases out on the sun-warmed tarmac. He winked at Sam and smiled at Amanda, genuinely regretting that he couldn't drop his early 20s and hit on this young mum. Fortunately, it wasn't a long walk to the village. Even so, Amanda had to stop at least 3 times to catch her breath. Still, as hard as it was, the suitcases were heavy on their own. And then there were the duffels, some crockery, and a few other small things. The village met the guests warily. The dogs, seeing the strangers, immediately began to bark. The geese hissed angrily, trying to grab Sam's leg. "I'm scared." Hiding behind Amanda's back, the son whispered, "Don't be afraid, they're just trying to get a rise out of you. They say we are the masters here, so we make our own rules." Amanda smiled and wagged her finger at one of the biggest geese. They walked for another 100 meters before Amanda saw a squat wooden building with a distinctive sign saying the paramedic station. Amanda smiled. "And this, son, is where I'm going to work." "Are you going to treat people here?" the boy asked uncertainly. "Well, not exactly like that. I'm not a doctor, but I'll help people when they're not well." "Well, let's go and get acquainted with my new place of work," Amanda suggested and headed for the door. The unlubricated hinges creaked softly. When they stepped inside, Amanda found the reception area small but cozy. There was a large old desk in the center, with a wooden chair lurking beside it. On the walls hung posters with medical illustrations and tables with various recommendations for patients. In the corner there was a small couch covered with a snow-white blanket. The room smelled of alcohol, iodine, and a peculiar odor that reminded Amanda of a hospital. "Hello," said a pleasant female voice behind her. Amanda and Sam, as if on cue, turned round and saw an older woman with kind blue eyes and blonde hair, gathered in a careless bundle. She was dressed in a distinctive white medical uniform that made her look like a doctor or paramedic. Come in. I'm Mrs. Mary," said the woman. Amanda introduced herself and her son. "Well, Amanda, I take it you're the employee Mr. Andrew Brown was talking about?" Mrs. Mary asked. "Yes, I am," Amanda replied timidly, hoping sincerely that the superintendent had not told her about the theft. Mrs. Mary smiled. "Well, if that's the case, then first of all, Amanda, you need to familiarize yourself with the basic rules and routine of the paramedic station. And of course, the basic disinfectants and medicines we have on hand." Amanda nodded in agreement. "All right, let's do it. In the meantime, Sam can look at the pictures on the wall. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, even for children," Mrs. Mary added. The son looked at the colorful illustrations with interest. The next hour and a half flew by. Amanda familiarized herself with the documents and the basic rules. Mrs. Mary patiently explained to her everything she had to do within the walls of their paramedic station. "Look, Amanda, you're going to have to be more of a nurse than an orderly for me here. So remember where everything is. There's green oil, also hydrogen peroxide, there's analgin, Corvalol. These are medicines that belong to the means of first necessity." Amanda diligently memorized everything. When you have some free time, you can flip through this book. It's a guide to emergency care. There's a lot of useful information in it, but for now you only need to memorize the basics. Mrs. Mary finished her briefing and said. Amanda took the book in her hands, realizing that she still had a lot to learn before she could become an indispensable assistant. "Well, Amanda, is the job not scaring you so much anymore? Tell me, do you have any overalls? Or should I get some from the warehouse?" Mrs. Mary asked. "No, I don't need any. I've got my own. I'm just going to get some now," Amanda replied and reached into her suitcase. "Oh, what a case. I can tell you're here to get a job, not just do nothing. Thanks to Mr. Brown, your boss. I used to have him as an intern. Oh, that was a long time ago," the paramedic said with nostalgia in her voice. Meanwhile, Amanda unzipped the suitcase with an effort and gasped. "Oh my God, it's someone else's stuff." "What do you mean it's someone else's?" Sam was alarmed. Mrs. Mary even came closer, interested in the news. The suitcase really did contain other things that didn't belong to Amanda. Instead of dresses and shoes, there were men's clothes, light-colored shirts with stiff collars similar to the ones Amanda's father had once worn. In the shoe department, black shoes made of fine leather and a pair of padded slippers. The suitcase was also full of little things: toilet water, toothbrush, toothpaste, soap, and a couple of towels. But what stood out was the mourning wreath at the very bottom. Amanda also found a silver bracelet in one of the pockets, just like the one that had been in Mr. Patterson's room. And it was because it was missing that she'd been dishonorably dismissed from surgery at City Hospital 1. What happened? Wrong luggage, Amanda thought. But who could have taken her suitcase? With trembling hands, Amanda quickly sorted through the stranger's belongings: clothes, shoes, wreath, bracelet. She'd never been particularly suspicious, but now her anxiety was multiplied several times over. And it was not because she had lost her uniform and personal belongings. The reason for the anxiety was something else. It was not just someone else's luggage. The point was that in the pocket of the stranger's suitcase was a stolen item. The realization of the terrible truth made Amanda dizzy. At that moment, she was brought to her senses by her son's excited voice. "Mum, that's the suitcase of that uncle who was on the bus with us. Remember, he was sitting in the front. He had one just like it." Amanda's mind began to worry again. How would she find her own things now? And what to do with this luggage? Should she go to the police? What would she say? Open someone else's suitcase, searched it. That's not a very good prospect. And it doesn't feel right. No, the police are out for now. Especially since it's far from certain that this bracelet belongs to the owner of the suitcase. I mean, he could have found it on the street, for example. "Amanda, are you in trouble? Tell me, is there anything I can do for you?" Mrs. Mary asked with concern in her voice. "No, thank you. I've already sorted it out. The bus driver just mixed up the suitcases and gave me and my son someone else's hand luggage," Amanda replied. She put the funeral wreath back. She noticed at once that it had a ribbon with a single phrase written in ornate handwriting with monograms at the ends: "To my beloved wife. From husband Michael." Then Amanda took the silver bracelet in her hands. It was as heavy and cold as stone. She felt a sudden urge to put it away before she got herself in trouble again. On the other hand, she couldn't take her eyes off him. It was hard to imagine a more beautiful and graceful piece, woven from silver threads like a delicate spider's web. It wrapped around its owner's wrist, pleasantly cooling his skin. The bracelet seemed to breathe, shimmering in the rays of light and playing with all shades of gray from pale, almost flesh-colored, to deep, almost black, depending on the time of day when it appeared before the eyes of the spectators. There could be no mistake, and Amanda understood that as well as anyone. This was the same bracelet that had nearly caused her to be prosecuted. Since there was nothing inside the suitcase that could help her find the owner, Amanda closed it, remembering to put the bracelet back. No matter how you look at it, you can't catch a thief. In fact, Amanda knew only that the owner of the suitcase was named Michael and his wife had died, but it was unlikely that this information could help her get on the stranger's trail. Deciding to leave the suitcase in the paramedics' warehouse, Amanda had to accept a white work uniform from Mrs. Mary. "Well, that's good, Amanda. Don't you worry about your things, they'll turn up, won't they? Now, I suggest you and Sam move into our staff house. It's not far away, almost next door," the paramedic said and headed for the door. Amanda smiled and followed, taking her own and the others' suitcases. Truth be told, she didn't feel sorry for the things at all. The point was something else, the truth. Had the owner of the suitcase stolen that bracelet? But why? For money. But he didn't look like a poor man, and in general, silver is much cheaper than gold, and from the sale of the bracelet could be a very small amount of money. But that's what life is all about. That's what Amanda thought as she followed her boss to her new apartment and dragged her suitcases with difficulty. Amanda stepped over the threshold of the old house. A faint light shone through the dust onto the white and green painted floors. The doorway was covered in cobwebs. The spiders that hid unhappily in the corner had long since grown accustomed to their power over this room. The house smelled damp and musty. The air was thick and heavy, which could be explained by the shuttered windows. "Wow! Are we going to live here?" Sam exclaimed. "Yeah, matey, what's wrong with it?" "But don't judge by appearances, they can be very deceiving," said Mrs. Mary, embarrassed. Amanda's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. She had come here to find a better life for herself and her son. No one forced her to do anything, so why be sad? Sam, tired from the long and difficult journey, touched her hand. "Where's our room?" he asked. "We'll see." Amanda reassured him, putting her arm around his shoulders. She then ran her hand along the dusty walls of the corridor, knowing full well that her palm would be dirty. There were only 3 rooms in the house. One was a tiny kitchen with a stove littered with smoldering pots and pans, and the other wooden shelves were filled with books and old yellowed photographs. But Amanda, with Mrs. Mary's prompting, stopped in front of the 3rd room, which was the largest and brightest of them all. It had 2 windows that gave an excellent view of the garden. True, they were shuttered now, but even that seemed a trifle unimportant. "This will be our room," Amanda said and smiled at her son. "Good choice, Amanda. Anyway, I'm sorry about the mess, but the house had been neglected for a long time. Well, make yourselves comfortable. I'm going back to the paramedic station, see if anyone needs any help." Mrs. Mary summed up and went out. Amanda nodded. Then she got down to business. As they say, the eyes are afraid, but the hands do the work. First, she scrubbed the floors and cleaned the window panes with a special solution. Then she reviewed the furniture, selecting from the pile of junk a whole and good one, so that their new home would be cozy again. Sam helped too, fetching water and even peeling potatoes for lunch, which she found in the house. By evening, the house was getting better and better. The walls shone with freshness and the shelves were cleaned of dust and plaque. The room smelled like home, and the sunlight shone through the clean windows in rainbow colors. Amanda looked proudly at the result of her work and smiled. Of course, the cleaning was far from over, and there was still a lot of work ahead of her. But at least now they had 2 clean rooms, the hall and the kitchen, where they could rest and eat respectively. Meanwhile, dusk was quietly falling over the village. Sam climbed onto the bed and looked with interest at the room that served as their bedroom and resting place at the same time. "Mum, is this place haunted?" the boy asked in a whisper, pointing his finger at a dark corner. Amanda smiled. "Of course it isn't. It's just an old house that can hold many stories within its walls." Sam nodded uncertainly and then immediately fell silent, mesmerized by the mystery of the room. As a loving mother, Mrs. Amanda Swan understood that at first it would be difficult for her son to get used to life in the village, especially to its silence and lack of entertainment. Finally, Sam settled down and closed his eyes. Mrs. Swan stood over her son for a few minutes longer, absorbed in her thoughts. Then, hearing his peaceful breathing, she quietly left the room and headed for the door. Night was slowly coming on. Mrs. Swan looked round. The moonlit courtyard seemed small but well kept. There was a wooden bench in the middle, and lilac bushes and a small bed of flowers around the edges. After enjoying the night scenery, Mrs. Swan returned to the house. She changed into her pajamas, washed her face, and locked the door for the night. Now she could go to bed with peace of mind. But what would happen tomorrow? No one knows. The morning is the morning, as they say. Mrs. Swan lay down on the bed and closed her eyes, feeling a pleasant fatigue spread through her body. Of course, as she fell into a restless sleep, Mrs. Swan had no idea that at that very moment, many miles away, her boss, Mr. Andrew Brown, was going through some of the most difficult moments of his life. There was silence in the intensive care unit, broken only by the sounds of the medical machines monitoring the patient's condition. The head of the surgical department stood by the bed where a man lay in a coma. Mr. Brown's face seemed tired, but his eyes remained clear and penetrating. At that moment, the events of the past few days flashed through his mind: the operation, the complications, the fight for the life of a wealthy patient. Mr. Brown understood that Mr. John Patterson's chances of recovery were slim. But on the other hand, no one knows what lies ahead. At that moment, a tall young man entered the ward, a hospital gown slung carelessly over his shoulders. The ward manager looked round and recognized the visitor at once. It was Matthew Patterson, Mr. John's son. Mr. Brown greeted him with a discreet nod. "How are you?" Matthew asked in lieu of greeting. Mr. Brown sighed sadly. "Your father's condition is still critical. He is in a coma." Matthew turned pale. "Doctor, tell me honestly, is there any hope of recovery?" The head of the department looked at him with an assessing gaze, as if trying to see into his soul. "Mr. Matthew, I can't make false hopes and promises. The chances of his recovery are slim, but we are doing everything we can." Matthew turned away, clenching the fingers of his hands into fists to the point of pain. "Doctor, is there any possibility that he may never come out of this state again? To put it simply, that my father will die because of your support, so to speak?" he asked. Mr. Brown frowned. "What are you talking about, Mr. Matthew? Don't forget yourself. This is not what I signed up for. It's one thing to sack a nurse who heard something she shouldn't have heard on a theft charge. It's another to make such a commitment. I'm not God to control people's fates. Besides, I took an oath as a doctor, in case you didn't know." Matthew hesitated. "But I really need my father to pass away. Because if he dies, I'll get the whole inheritance. I'm sure my father won't make it." At this point, Mr. Brown felt a pang of disgust for his guest. He was a surgeon and not a bad doctor on the whole, but for him to stain his hands with crime. "Mr. Matthew, I don't think we have anything more to talk about," said the superintendent. Matthew turned even paler. To tell the truth, he hadn't expected such a reaction. "Doctor, I beg you, please. I will give you part of the inheritance. Believe me, it was a lot of work to change my father's will and bribe the notary. But will you refuse to help me now when the inheritance is just around the corner?" With a strained voice, the young man blurted out. But the superintendent was adamant. Yes, he had dismissed Mrs. Swan so that she could not witness the original drafting of Mr. Patterson's will, the one in which the respected businessman wanted to leave his entire fortune to the orphanages. Little did they know that Matthew had gone to extraordinary lengths to persuade the notary to go along with the scam. Probably, if not for his daughter's problems, the lawyer would never have gone for it. But they say money works wonders. Gritting his teeth with anger, Matthew left the room, saying goodbye. "Don't miscalculate like my father, doctor, or it'll be too late." Meanwhile, Mr. Brown was alone with his patient. He looked at the businessman's motionless body and tears glistened in his eyes. The aged doctor stubbornly failed to understand how a son, even an adopted one, could treat his parent in such a way. How could one wait for the death of a loved one for his own gain? Mr. Brown placed his hand on the patient's forehead. Then he looked at the machines monitoring the patient's condition. They were humming like a living organism. "It's all right. We'll fight you, Mr. Patterson," whispered the head of the department and left the room. Once again, he found himself regretting the dismissal of the nurse. But what could be done? When Matthew Patterson had cleverly trapped the eminent doctor in a gambling debt that had to be paid in a short time, The businessman's son had simply bought a receipt written by Mr. Brown from the creditors and blackmailed him. Mrs. Swan's fate was thus sealed. Naturally, no one stole the ill-fated bracelet that Mr. Pattison valued above all else. It was the lust for profit and Matthew's desire to rework his father's will. And Mrs. Swan had been the only witness to the preliminary announcement of Mr. Pattison's last will. Matthew was afraid that at one not-so-great moment she might speak up and put all his schemes in jeopardy. His mother, Caroline Pattison, had said, "Don't worry, son. Firstly, make inquiries about this person. What's going on? And then we'll decide what to do next." Matthew smiled. "Yes, I've been doing that for a while now. Anyway, single mom. Fiancé left her before her son was born. Parents are dead. She's struggling to get by. But according to her colleague Helen, she's very principled. She wouldn't collude." Caroline thought about it. "She wouldn't, you say? But then we have to go at it from the other side, accusations of theft. For starters, at least the bracelet your father wears without taking it off. Get her partner to do it, and we're good to go." Matthew smiled happily. "That's a good idea. What's with the bracelet? Why does he carry it around with him all the time? Silver's a cheap piece of jewelry. Oh, I wish it was gold." "I don't know. The answer to that question must be somewhere in John's past. He's a strange man. I never liked him. He's an idiot. But in my day, I just had no choice. You're a year old, your alcoholic husband left you with a lot of debts. And here's some bloke with a lot of money. So I took him on, and now we're dealing with it. I wish he'd get over it sooner. There's no life." Caroline replied with irritation. Matthew heeded his mother's words and did the right thing. He got an ally in the head of the department and bribed the notary. Then accused Mrs. Swan of stealing the bracelet that Helen had actually taken. Of course, the poor nurse didn't know all this and was desperate to establish herself in her new position. Of course, the village paramedic's office was no godsend, but it was better than nothing. Now, Amanda's life was beginning to change. To her surprise, working in the province was not as difficult as she had first thought. Mrs. Mary was helpful in all her endeavors and shared her knowledge. A week flew by, followed by another. Amanda had already settled into the village and felt almost like she belonged. She learned to measure blood pressure, give drips, and sometimes even gave injections. Although she was not a nurse by training, she had been taught everything by her kind boss, who was respected by everyone in the neighborhood from small to large. The only thing that troubled Amanda was the suitcase. Why wasn't Michael looking for it? Wasn't he sorry to part with the bracelet? But then why had he decided to steal it, after which he carried it with him so carefully? Amanda didn't know the answer to that question. Perhaps she would not have learned it in the future, if a couple of days later one very strange event had not happened. And it all began with the fact that one hot July afternoon local farmer Sways found a girl in the barn, screaming in a voice that was not her own. Lightning flashed overhead and the air smelled of moisture. She looked like a vagrant, dirty clothes, greasy hair, no shoes to speak of. But the worst thing was not even that, but the fact that the stranger was pregnant, literally pregnant. The farmer scratched the back of his head, trying not to look at the woman in labor. He called Jacob, the tractor driver, for help. Together they built a sort of stretcher and carried the unfortunate woman to the paramedic station. "Mrs. Mary, help me out. I've got a tramp hiding in the barn. She's going into labor, and I've got this. My water's broken," said the farmer in a guilty tone. Seeing the stranger, the paramedic immediately changed in her face. "She needs to go to the district for a cesarean. And what a huge belly. Are there twins, beautiful?" she asked, addressing the woman in labor. "I don't know. My name is Emma. It could be 3, I don't know. I haven't had an ultrasound or registered. Oh God, it hurts. You've got to help me, for God's sake. What are you looking at?" The stranger was indignant. Amanda was astonished. To tell the truth, it was the first time she had ever seen such a thing. Feeling her abdomen with her hands, Mrs. Mary gave a curt command. "Amanda, call an ambulance. It's a multiple pregnancy. I don't know anything about this kind of thing." Amanda started to dial the number with a trembling hand, but the call kept dropping. The farmer and the tractor driver left immediately, as they could no longer hear the screams of the unfortunate woman in labor. Meanwhile, the bad weather outside the window had reached its peak. The lightning flashed so often that it made the eyes blurred. Thunder rumbled against her eardrums, causing Mrs. Amanda Swan to crouch in fear. The wind had also picked up, threatening to become a hurricane. The walls of the paramedic station groaned. They snapped like dry branches under a forester's boots. It was at that moment that Mrs. Amanda Swan realized they would never get help, especially after the dispatcher reported that the road towards the village was blocked by a huge, uprooted trunk of an old oak tree. God, what are we going to do now? Mrs. Amanda Swan sobbed and covered her face with her hands. What are we going to do? We'll try it ourselves, Mrs. Mary said over the noise of the storm. But it's one thing to say it, another to do it. Mrs. Amanda Swan felt in her heart that the paramedic had never experienced a pregnancy like this before. But there was nothing to be done. We can't just leave this woman to her fate. Come on, push, sweetheart. Mrs. Mary was stroking the woman's belly and saying. The woman screamed at the whole village. But it was no use. The local old ladies knelt down and began to recite prayers for God's help. But relief never came. The mother screamed, cried, scratched the sweat-soaked sheets with her fingernails. It was all in vain. Sweat trickled down Mrs. Mary's forehead and her lips trembled treacherously. She held the woman's hand, trying to make her feel better. Outside the window, a downpour of thunder and fierce gusts of wind was beginning to fall. At that moment, the door swung open. A drenched male figure appeared on the threshold. The wind shuddered. Amanda recognized the same passenger from the bus who had been the owner of the suitcase. Mrs. Mary froze in amazement as the guest commanded. Now, where do you have a place to wash your hands? I'm a surgeon from a private clinic. I was stopped on the motorway by some agitated farmer, shouting, "Hurry up, mate, help me, take me." Yeah, how am I supposed to drive him when there's a tree blocking the road? Mrs. Amanda Swan smiled and immediately helped him out of his windbreaker. So, is there anesthetic? The doctor asked again. Mrs. Mary nodded meekly. Putting the reins in the hands of professionals, everything that happened afterwards passed like a dream for Mrs. Amanda Swan. The moans of the woman in labor, the commands of the surgeon and paramedic, the cries of the babies, triplets, and no C-section. As it turned out a little later, Michael Knightley turned out to be a real professional and did without major surgical intervention. Taking from his hands one baby after another, Mrs. Amanda Swan cried and did not stop whispering some prayers. As they say, there are no unbelievers in such extreme situations. After about 40 minutes, it was all over. The woman, exhausted from labor, was fast asleep, and Mrs. Mary prepared dry baby formula from her own supplies. Mrs. Amanda Swan took turns feeding the babies from the bottle and exhaled a sigh of relief. Only now was she able to look into the eyes of her savior, to tell her that the bus driver had simply mixed up their suitcases that fateful day. Michael smiled. Yes, I realized that myself. I was on my way to see my wife at the cemetery. I didn't use the car. She was from a neighboring village. I thought I'd stay the night at her mother's. She's often ill. I bought a wreath, and this happened. Mrs. Amanda Swan lowered her eyes in embarrassment. She could not find the strength to ask the most disturbing question about the silver bracelet that was in one of the compartments of Michael's suitcase. Of course, she realized it was unlikely that such a man could be a thief, especially given his status and responsible job. But the truth was much simpler than Mrs. Amanda Swan had thought. The bracelet actually belonged to Michael's late wife, Mia, whose life was taken by an early stroke. She, on the other hand, had inherited the bracelet from her mother, Nadezhda, who lived in the neighboring village. Mrs. Amanda Swan listened and couldn't believe herself. So such a thing was not the only thing in nature? And at the same moment, unable to contain her emotions, Mrs. Amanda Swan cried and told Michael everything as it was. The surgeon listened in silence, only occasionally asking questions. Mrs. Amanda Swan, on the other hand, told him everything, both about her dismissal and about the mysterious bracelet. After listening to her rambling story, Michael thought for a moment, then said, "I think I can help you solve this case." Apparently, Mr. John Pattison was my Mia's father. So he made 2 bracelets, one for himself and one for her mum, Mrs. Kate. Amanda Swan shrugged uncertainly. I still don't know what to say. Michael, on the other hand, didn't waste any time. After the storm was over, he called his mother-in-law. And that's when Mrs. Amanda Swan was in for another surprise. The mother-in-law confirmed the young surgeon's theories. Many years ago, John and Kate had met, made plans for the future together, but then they had to part. Through the fault of John himself, who had to go on a long business trip abroad. In farewell, he gave his bride a silver bracelet, made by a private jeweler in 2 copies. Unfortunately, after parting, feelings of lovers, as expected, came to naught. Here is only in memory of the connection with John. Kate had a daughter, Mia, who later married Surgeon Michael. In this case, Kate never once tried to find a former fiancé to tell him about the birth of a daughter. And now, thanks to her son-in-law, Mrs. Kate has such an opportunity. But only going to the ward, she decided not to talk about her daughter, so as not to reopen old wounds. Why aggravate his already poor condition? As it happened, Mr. John Pattison had been brought out of his coma with the help of the repentant head of surgery. And for his stepson Matthew, it meant only one thing: the end of all hopes and fantasies of inheritance. Shyly entering the ward, Mrs. Kate could not hold back her tears at the sight of the man she had once loved with all her heart. Kate, darling, how could you do this? No warning. And I was about to die. The businessman stretched out guiltily, but the head of the department immediately pulled him back. Don't even think about it. At the moment you are rapidly recovering, Mr. John Pattison, which means that everything is still ahead of you, said the doctor. The businessman smiled and got up from the bed and hugged his first love. At the same time, Mrs. Amanda Swan and Michael, who were standing in the room, tactfully turned away. Seizing the moment, the ward manager approached the former nurse and apologized. I'm sorry to you, Amanda. What's there to say? It's Helen. But the fact that I set you up and stole your bracelet, and then you went to the police and told them what happened. You got a guilty conscience? Amanda asked. Yeah, lucky me. They didn't prosecute me. They took into account, so to speak, the previous merits, a sincere confession. Anyway, they revoked the license of that corrupt notary. Matthew was called in for questioning. Only the fools run away, and they've put out an APB on him. They'll catch him. You come back if you want to. I'll take you in and give you a good place, and you'll get a minimum wage. The superintendent offered. Mrs. Amanda Swan smiled and shook her head. No, Mr. Brown, it's not for me. I'd rather be a paramedic at the station. In the village, that is. Especially as I've got a new addition to the family. What new addition? Have you had a baby, Amanda? You've got it. The superintendent marveled. But Mrs. Amanda Swan shook her head in protest. No, Mr. Andrew Brown, have you? We had a woman in labor the other day. A tramp. Called herself Emma. She gave birth to 3, ran away in the night on the 2nd day, opened a window and was gone. There was no way to support the children, no house, no yard. The children were in danger of being taken to an orphanage. So I decided to take custody of them. They're my family. Especially since Michael volunteered to help. Mr. Andrew Brown smiled and understood at once what was between the lines. Mrs. Amanda Swan and Michael liked each other so much that the custody arrangement would bring them even closer together. With his arm round the young people's shoulders, the ward manager wished them happiness and prosperity from the bottom of his heart. Soon Mr. John Pattison joined in the congratulations and took their word that they would be married on the same day, with him and Kate, who gave her consent right in the hospital room. Mrs. Amanda Swan smiled and furtively looked at Michael and caught herself thinking that life was a very wonderful thing. Helga and Andrew were together for almost 3 years. The woman believed that marriage was almost a settled issue, because at first her beloved constantly said that in just a little while they would have free funds for a luxurious celebration. Embarrassed, Helga tried to explain that she didn't need any big celebrations. But the man, hugging her tightly, convinced everything should be perfect for my beloved girl. The best restaurant, a luxurious dress, A stunning photo shoot so that years later we can show the wedding album to our children with such speeches. Helga completely lost the ability to argue with her beloved and patiently waited for Andrew to finally decide that the accumulated funds would be enough for all his ideas. The woman sometimes felt that her partner was fooling her, but he skillfully supported her faith in a happy future. And in the end, she even defended him in front of her relatives. My mother, who moved many years ago following her new husband to the other side of the country, constantly received Helga in phone conversations and correspondence in instant messengers. "Daughter, take off your rose-colored glasses. Since your Andrew says he loves you but still doesn't want to get married, run away from him. He just settled down comfortably, living on everything he had ready, and you don't even have the right to vote to defend a modest wedding, as you want." Brother Denny prudently did not meddle in his sister's affairs. But his wife, Lily, completely agreed with her mother-in-law and convinced Helga, "Honestly, it's a pity to watch how you waste your life. Yes, it was enough for me to see how this Andrew treats you once to understand that nothing worthwhile will come of you. Besides, as far as I managed to catch, his relatives are not at all happy with you. Do you remember how many times he took you to visit your parents, Helga, and love, tried to protect Andrew?" Lily continued to persuade, citing, as it seemed to her, an ironclad argument. If they greeted you normally, you would happily go to them. To this, Helga had nothing to say. On Andrew's side, her relatives were not at all delighted with her, and the young woman was even disgusted to remember how the face of her beloved mother grimaced when she named her profession. Helen, Andrew's sister, did not remain silent and loudly asked, "So do you do a manicure?" "That's cool. I file and paint my nails all day long. Granny, can you hear?" She shouted towards the kitchen. Andrew will now always go with a manicure and pedicure, and will probably get it too. Helga was not shy about her work, but she was very uncomfortable. In addition, Andrew, after sitting at the table for a while, explained that he needed to make an important call, and went out onto the landing. The man returned when his mother was already putting the cake on the table, and Helga was exhausted by Helen's questions and malicious jokes. She was ready to howl. She wanted to send the whole company and the women looking condescendingly at her to hell. And had the beloved stayed even a few more minutes, most likely the guest would not have been able to stand it, and told the hostesses everything she thought about their snobbery. As if to atone for his escape from the holiday dinner on the way home, Andrew was especially courteous to Helga. In general, the woman in love decided that she would not overreact to the unkind reception given to her and enjoyed the company of her loved one. A year has passed since Helga moved in with Andrew. The second year flew by, the third year was coming to an end, and no changes in social status were foreseen. Moreover, Helga began to guess that her beloved had ceased to be faithful to her. Outwardly, everything was almost the same as before, but small details gave Andrew away completely. At first, he stopped picking her up after finishing work. He made an excuse by saying that he had to stay late because of a large order. And she believed and felt sorry for the unfortunate man who has to do everything for himself and for others. He eagerly flew away with everything that was prepared for his arrival, and completely stopped inviting her somewhere to unwind, as was their custom so recently. Now, after dinner, Andrew lay down on the sofa or sat near the game console to complete the next level. Helga tried to initiate joint entertainment, but it seemed that nothing could move Andrew from his favorite places at home. "Baby, I'm so exhausted," the man explained. "Give me at least a little rest. You're smart, and you understand perfectly how tired I am." Helga quietly stepped aside and went to clean, do laundry, or do some other work. Recently, it has become painful for her that upon returning home from work, Andrew was not eager as usual to hug her, but first hurried to the shower. Helga tried not to force things and not to strain the relationship, fearing that scandals would lead to a breakup. The only act that the woman did against the will of her beloved was that in the second year of living together she brought a small puppy into the apartment, at a quick glance at which it was obvious that there were many breeds among its ancestors. Can you imagine? Someone threw it in a tied bag in the trash. I threw out the trash. I hear some rustling. I thought that the rats were completely insolent and weren't afraid of anyone. And then I realized that someone inside the bag took it out, untied it, and there. Helga looked helplessly at her loved one, who was wincing from the story told to him as if from an attack of toothache, and spoke categorically. "I have nothing against animals, but you'd better take this flea-beard one to where you found it. He's scary, like some kind of hobbit." Helga objected. "He's not scary. Very charming, too. The paws are so furry." Listen, let's call him Frodo. The woman gave a lot of arguments. And finally, although without much enthusiasm, Andrew agreed. The puppy remained in the apartment and grew up to the delight of Olia. She considered him her best friend, and partly caring for the baby distracted her from thoughts that it was time to give birth to a child. However, before this important event, Helga hoped to one day hear a marriage proposal. She had particular hopes for a joint vacation, which they had planned almost 6 months in advance. But suddenly Andrew changed his mind and explained. Listen, take someone for your company and go on vacation without me. At work, the project won't be completed without me. We'll relax with you sometime later. Out of solidarity, Helga also did not go to warmer climes. Besides, she didn't want to burden Andrew with caring for Frodo. She took up household chores that everyone had never gotten around to before, tried to make the apartment cozy, and even did some minor cosmetic repairs on her own. Moreover, Andrew has long reproached the woman for the fact that the puppy she picked up caused a lot of destruction to the apartment. This dog of yours does not bring any benefit, only losses from it. The door was scratched. Give her to a shelter. They will try to place her in a family. And if you really want to, you can play around with sponsoring this establishment a little. However, if in some ways Helga was ready to endlessly adapt to her loved one, then in the matter of the dog's place of residence, she was adamant. Frodo didn't do anything too terrible, and I won't take him to any shelter. The dog was a faithful companion in all walks, which Andrew increasingly refused to do. Helga sometimes felt that their relationship no longer resembled love at all, but represented a format of communication between the master of the house and the servants. The woman tried to find an excuse for her partner, but the end of the affair was very unexpected. About an hour after Andrew left on a business trip, the apartment door suddenly swung open, and Helga, thinking that the man had forgotten something, jumped out into the hallway in a t-shirt and short shorts and saw her beloved sister. Frodo, not too angrily, but carefully bared his teeth at the illegal guest, who brazenly opened the apartment with a spare key, and she rudely declared, taking pepper spray out of her pocket, "Come on, put the dog somewhere in the toilet, otherwise she won't find it enough. And let's go talk." Such an aggressive start to Andrew's sister's visit came as a complete surprise to Helga. However, she did not argue, and hiding the dog, invited her to go into the room. "In general, we need to talk seriously," the guest announced. "Mom chose an excellent match for Andrew. Profitable, unlike you. The family he ends up with will greatly help his career. And with you, he is only wasting time. So it will work for pennies. He himself does not dare to tell you about it, but he and a suitable bride have already submitted an application. There will be a wedding soon. Only he feels sorry for you, you see, and has no idea how to break this news. And there is no reason for me to start a ceremony with you. So come on, pack your things and clear the area. Leave the apartment. And don't think that you can bear everything that doesn't belong to you. I'll be watching you. Otherwise, you never know. You decide to steal something." Helga recovered from the absurdity of everything that was happening quite quickly, because she simply could not believe Helen's words and tried to shield the groom. "What nonsense. I saw Andrew off an hour ago, and he said goodbye to me very warmly." "Do not believe. You're right. If you want, call him and ask him directly." Helga listened to the advice and told Andrew in a few words about his sister's visit and clarified. "Is it true that you are planning to marry another woman? Do I need to pack my things now," as Helen put it. The not too confident voice on the phone was the first blow for Helga. The woman sat down on a chair and heard something that instantly broke her heart. "Helga, you are very good. You are the best woman in my life. But circumstances have developed so that we need to separate." Under the malicious gaze of Helen, who didn't even think about leaving the room, Helga tried not to cry, but it was impossible to hold back the tears, and she almost shouted, "Why didn't you tell me everything personally?" Andrew, who managed to collect his thoughts after the initial confusion, stopped being embarrassed and answered cheerfully, "Sorry. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about the breakup several times, but somehow I didn't want to offend you. Understand, I'm also a living person, and it's not easy for me to erase everything that happened between us." The man said something else, but Helga, putting the phone on the table, stopped listening to him. Each of his phrases felt like a dull pain in his chest, and he wanted to hide from Helen's mocking gaze. The woman, acting as if under hypnosis, began to pack her things, bitterly reflecting on the fact that the rolling suitcase she had bought for the trip had come in handy. Only now it's not a foreign voyage planned, but a move, essentially to nowhere. Helga stopped abruptly. And where did the moral strength come from? Look, I don't even have anywhere to go right now. Because with a dog, it's unlikely that I'll be able to quickly find rented housing. Give me a few days, please. I'll find an apartment where the owners will let us in. And I'll take Frodo right away. Give me at least 2 days. By the time Andrew returns, I and the dog will have already left here. However, Helen was determined. Never. You never know how you will behave. And then how can I justify myself to my brother? Come on, get ready, and don't forget your dog. Listen, why are you pretending to be a naive fool, and even trying to push for pity? You probably know that my brother has always been against animals in the apartment. Only you are a benefactor. True, at someone else's expense. From what I hear, your dog is scratching the bathroom door. Andrew is right. There are only losses from you and this flea. On a good note, we should take money from you for repairs. But I'm not petty. So fold your laundry and clothes and go ahead, sorry, goodbye. Helga became disgusted from her own gullibility and some kind of emotional blindness. She felt deep down that Andrew had not been completely honest with her lately, but she still tried not to notice any warning bells. So I waited. The bells turned into an alarm bell from Helen's shrill voice and real betrayal from Andrew. She somehow threw things, which turned out to be not so much, into the suitcase, put an almost new down jacket into a bulky shopping bag, and picked up a bag with the remains of food for Frodo in the kitchen. She acted mechanically. She opened the bathroom, put a leash on the dog, leaving the muzzle dangling around her neck, and left the apartment where she spent almost 3 years of her life. Frodo carried a bag of food in his teeth, walking sedately, and was nearby, occasionally distracting himself to mark trees that were especially interesting to him. And Helga had no idea where they were going. Both her mother and her brother's wife warned her that Andrew was too keen on getting married, but she didn't want to hear the reasonable arguments of her relatives. The beloved constantly somehow explained the impossibility of getting married in the near future. And now, Please's sister humiliatingly kicked the girl out of the apartment. Helga understood that she was left with nothing. It was possible to try to compensate for the amount of repairs made in Andrew's apartment with her money, because he bought himself a foreign car for the occasion, but the woman did not have the slightest desire to meet with this man and members of his family anymore. Outbred Frodo as a dog that she herself fed and raised. That's all the memory of the relationship. Besides, if she had listened to Andrew, she wouldn't have had a pet. Mom has long been building her happiness on the other side of the country, and going to her, of course, is not an option at all. Only Denny remains. Helga happily found a phone in the pocket of her shorts, in which she left her ex-lover's apartment, and called her brother. Without going into details, the woman asked, "Hello, can I stay with Frodo today?" The brother, sensing something was wrong in his younger sister's voice, immediately agreed and suggested, "Where are you now?" "I'm somewhere in your area on business. Maybe I should grab you and the dog?" Helga happily accepted her brother's offer and named the cafe where she often met with Lilia and her nephews as a landmark. Andrew categorically did not want her relatives to visit his apartment, and now the woman clearly saw in this behavior the frivolity of her former roommate's intentions. The daughter-in-law did not have to wait long. In the back seat of the family car and child car seats were nephews, the eldest, 7-year-old Max, and the youngest, 1-year-old George, who joyfully waved their hands to their beloved aunt and dog. Lily immediately understood from the tear-stained eyes of her husband's sister what had happened, and opening the trunk to help put a few belongings there, Helga casually remarked, "I won't even remind you that I warned you about the vile nature of your Andrew. I'll just say I'm very glad that you woke up. It was high time to end this relationship. Rejoice in your freedom, and do not be sad for someone who is not worthy of you. He's not worth your little finger." A drone and a weakling. Helga sat in the front seat. Frodo managed to sit at the feet of his hostess, very compactly for his size, and soon the whole company was already accommodated in the small apartment of Denny and Lily. Helga understood that in a family with 2 children growing up, she and her dog would greatly displace the owners, and she started calling colleagues from the salon where she worked. However, no one had relatives or acquaintances who could rent out the corner for an acceptable price. Anne's boss, however, offered an option, but the owner of the apartment asked for such a high rental price that, if she agreed to it, she simply would not have anything to live on. Max fussed with Frodo, showing his younger brother how joyfully the dog alternately gave paws, as if playing. And the two women watching this sweet picture smiled synchronously. Helga shrugged guiltily. "Sorry, Lily, but it looks like you won't be able to find an apartment quickly." Not even a shadow of irritation or dissatisfaction flashed on Lily's face. On the contrary, she suggested, as if making excuses. "Helga, if you don't mind, let's put you and Frodo on the balcony for now. It's warm now, and there's already a cot there. I myself enjoy watching the city there in the evenings. It will probably be a little inconvenient, but there is generally not enough space in the kitchen." There was a table with a refrigerator. They could barely fit it in. It's a pity that we haven't had time to expand our living conditions yet, but now there will be an incentive to move more actively. Then there will be enough space for everyone. Denny, who came home from work in the evening, suggested that his sister talk to Andrew like a man, but Helga flatly refused. "No, don't. You'll find more problems on your own. Let him live as he wants." Albeit cramped, but not offended, Helga spent the night in her brother's apartment, although she understood that the option of walking from the balcony through the master's bedroom to take the dog for a walk in the morning was not at all convenient. After breakfast, Lily suddenly turned to Olya with a strange question. "Actually, what keeps you in this area? You can find a job anywhere in the city." Helga shrugged. "The owner, Alice, has a chain of salons. She sometimes allows us to change locations due to relocation or when there is a vacancy." The daughter-in-law almost clapped her hands. "Look, I think I know what to do. My aunt left me with a house on the outskirts of the city, with all the amenities, by the way. Of course, no one has lived there since the winter, and a general cleaning will probably be required, but this is the normal way out of the situation. You ask your boss if she has a salon in that area and if there is free space in it, and I think everything will just work out wonderfully. Fresh air. The dog, again, is free. We will visit you. It will be really cool in the summer. I can even move there with the boys." Denny strongly supported his wife's idea. "Lily, but you're right. Really, how did this not occur to me?" Helga doubted that the boss would meet her halfway, but the idea was indeed a good one. The woman decided that she was not risking anything, even if Alice could not transfer her to another salon. You can at least try to live in Lee's house, find money, and go to work. Even if you have to leave early, the issue of housing will be resolved. And now for Helga and her pet, this was the most important thing. The conversation with Alice did not bring any positive results. However, the owner of the salon chain promised. "Helga, you are in good standing with me. So as soon as I think about opening a point in that area, I already know who I'll invite to work there. But for now, I need you here. I think there is no reason for you to leave me, since getting a new job is always problematic. You understand that I do not accept lateness. So please plan your route to work so as not to keep our visitors waiting." "Fine." Olya had no choice but to agree. As a result, the woman's spring and summer were filled with numerous worries, which were mainly associated with the need to travel almost an hour one way from her temporary shelter to her place of work. It's good that thanks to Lily's friendliness and sincerity, Helga did not feel awkward. On the contrary, when the daughter-in-law and her sons, as promised, came to live in a private house, the woman became much happier. Frodo, who attracted boys like a magnet, was also not bored while his mistress was away. Denny and Lily were finally able to get a larger apartment with the help of government payments, and Helga happily tried to repay their relatives for their kind attitude. The woman, when she could, worked with her nephews, and also participated in the renovation process. Maybe it wasn't always easy to manage the active Max and Alex, who had just recently learned to walk and was diligently looking for a way to give himself a bruise, but there was finally no time to think about the unpleasant separation. Lily introduced Helga to neighbors whom she had known since her childhood, and she had a good relationship with almost everyone. As a result, the abandoned woman even gained a small clientele. Even though the part-time work was not too significant and was sometimes even expressed in natural products, it increased Helga's self-esteem. However, she did not always try to bend to what her neighbors told her when they came for manicures. The woman cared little about the opinions of those around her, who, seeing how the dog lived calmly in the house Frodo, was given a personal chair, and he, having a not at all evil disposition, limited himself to attentive observation of everything that was happening around him, said "Ugh." "Keep the dog in the house." The neighbor on the left, Jane, was indignant when she came in to get her nails in order. "Look, There's a booth in the yard. Put it on a chain, and that's it. It'll be more useful. Why are you feeding him in vain?" Helga was not offended by such talk. Frodo was her true friend, and it was useless to convince a fully grown lady of anything. In addition, the dog turned out to be an excellent companion for the boys, which means that it was necessary to take special care of its cleanliness, and all advice to place the dog on the street was completely ignored. Thanks to the increasing flow of acquaintances who decided to get a manicure from her, the abandoned woman realized that her skills were in demand, and she, especially given the support of her relatives, would not be lost. Helga tried not to remember or think about Andrew. She even began to succeed. Denny was happy for his sister, who now looked much better than on the day when, with eyes reddened from tears, she appeared on the threshold of his old family nest. Lily was also happy that the girl had finally learned to smile again. Closer to autumn, Lily and her children returned to a new apartment, where quite pleasant renovations had already been made. It was time for the eldest nephew to get ready for school and explore a new territory, the desk, where he had to learn his lessons. Lily asked straightforwardly, "What, Helga, are you staying, or will you move with us? Now there is enough space for everyone, and it will be closer to work. It's a shame to spend so much time on the road." Max intervened in the conversation between the adults and said, "There will definitely be enough for everyone, and you will help me with my homework, it's true." However, Helga refused the proposal from her relatives. "If possible, I will stay here. I really liked it here. And Frodo is better here." Denny, without insisting, still told his sister, "If you get bored or sad, just let us know. We will pick you and Frodo up immediately." Agreed? Helga hugged her family one by one and promised, "If anything happens, I'll definitely tell you." "Thank you." Whenever possible, Helga came to visit her brother when her help was needed, but she always finally refused the offer to move into an apartment, saying that she and the dog were much calmer in nature. The woman did not yet suspect that soon the calm period of her life would come to an unexpected end. Cold and autumn flashed by. And then, obeying the eternal law of nature, bright white snow fell to the ground and everything became gloomy. The frost has already firmly grabbed all the puddles and turned the off-road conditions on the roadway into miniature mountain ranges. Helga now had to wake up even earlier to get to work on time. But the slightly shifted regime did not bother her much. Life on the outskirts of the city seemed to come to a standstill as darkness fell. Sometimes, of course, there were noisy cars whizzing by and dogs doing roll call, but overall the area was quiet and calm. Helga liked everything here, and her pet clearly enjoyed this lifestyle. One night, Frodo suddenly began to behave strangely. He worriedly, which was something exceptional for him, touched the mistress's hand with his cold, wet nose, sliding his claws along the floor, running from the door to Helga's bed. Without waiting for dawn, the owner could not stand it and decided to take the pet out for a walk. The woman became worried what if the dog ate some kind of poison. "So, we need to see how the dog behaves on the street." And sighing, Helga quickly pulled on her sweatpants and put her feet in her sneakers. Putting on her jacket, she thought that it was time to prepare winter shoes. There was hardly anything comfortable in the local store. This means that after work, you need to walk around the city's shopping centers and look for new clothes. In addition, it would be a good idea to visit construction stores and consider the option of insulating the veranda. If you approach the matter wisely, then you will get a good winter refrigerator. And in warmer seasons, the veranda can become an additional room. Of course, this idea had to be discussed with Lilia and her brother, but first we needed to at least roughly estimate how much it would cost to implement the bold idea. The dog stomped fussily at the threshold, distracting him from his thoughts, and Helga hurried to open the door. The miracle never happened. The snow never fell. The sky was overcast and quite dark. In the bright light of the lantern, the familiar courtyard looked unusual, and even somehow mysterious. Frodo immediately rushed to the apple tree that grew near the gate, and began to bark, and then whined softly. Approaching, Helga saw a package lying under a tree. It only took a split second to understand that someone had thrown a small child into the yard. The woman grabbed the bundle and hurried into the saving warmth of the house, mentally reproaching herself for not immediately taking the dog outside, which clearly sensed the foundling. In the room, Helga, who had gained experience in handling small children by helping her daughter-in-law care for Denny, unwrapped the blanket and realized that it was time to change the swaddle for the girl lying in front of her. It was very fortunate that Lily left some of her son's things in the house. Therefore, there were no problems getting the little one in order. But what to do now with such a find? Helga shook the blanket to hang it on the radiator, and a note printed on the printer suddenly fell out of the lining. I'm scared to leave my daughter to the mercy of fate, but there is no other option. Believe me, I have a compelling, almost justifiable reason for doing what I do. Take care of my girl. Heaven bless my little one and you. Helga felt uneasy. It was all very strange. It seemed that the words were sincere, but this in no way connected in the woman's mind with the cruelty of the act. It turns out that the person who dropped the child off deliberately took a risk for the baby's health by leaving her on the street rather than dropping her off in some warmer place. What if Frodo had not asked to leave? Or if she hadn't released it? Leah became scared. But it was necessary to act, and urgently, even if it was night outside. The woman wanted to warm the milk, but was afraid that the child might have an allergy, so she decided to call an ambulance, doctors, and the police. The dispatcher, we must give her credit, sent a team very quickly. The doctors examined the baby and shook their heads when they heard Helga's confused explanations that she had found the child and did not know what to do with him. The paramedic, a middle-aged woman, advised, "We, of course, can now take the baby to a children's hospital, but to be honest, there are no special indications for this. The girl is about 6 to 7 months old, judging by her development and external condition. She lived in good conditions. She was clearly well looked after, and being in the frosty air did not have time to harm her. Your dog seemed to sense something was wrong almost immediately, and the girl didn't even get hypothermic, fortunately. If possible, wait for the police. Actually, I have no right to say this, but the later the child ends up in a government institution, the better, in my opinion, it will be. You can give your baby warm water from a spoon. If you have zucchini, cook it and puree it. Try to give a treat if suddenly the child begins to cough, sneeze, or any other symptoms appear. Do not engage in amateur activities and call the team. You never know what we missed during the inspection. All clear?" Helga nodded her head, thinking that it looked like she would have to take time off from work today to wait for the police, because bothering Lily and asking her to come was not an option. Not only does the daughter-in-law have to take Max to school in the morning, but she also has to drag Denny across the city. Having seen off the ambulance crew, Helga, under the attentive gaze of the dog, took the girl he had found in her arms and began to rock her. Once upon a time, a woman really wanted to give birth to a child for her beloved Andrew, but the implementation of the idea somehow kept getting postponed. Only now suddenly there was such a wave of tenderness towards a defenseless creature. However, the thought of keeping the child did not arise. As soon as the morning came into its own, the woman warned Alice that she would not be able to come to work, and after listening to the boss's grumbling, for the first time she seriously thought about leaving the salon. The policeman came when the clock was already approaching noon, and immediately began asking Helga about all the circumstances of the case. The woman openly explained that she discovered the child in time only thanks to Frodo. "It's good that he raised me. The baby could have frozen if it weren't for him. Doctors said she was completely healthy and was receiving good care." Fyodor, having studied the note, put it in a bag, patted the smart dog on his wide head, and then clarified. "Well, if the doctors said that everything is fine, then I'm sending your find to the baby home." Swallowing the lump that suddenly appeared in her throat, Helga answered in monosyllables. "Yes." Deep down in her heart, she felt sorry for the girl. But the woman believed that at that moment she was doing the only right thing. Soon after the formalities were settled, representatives of the relevant police department appeared at the house, and the district police officer briefly explained to them what had happened. The found baby was taken away, thanking Helga for her concern, and the woman finally relaxed. Having treated Frodo to meat, she began to clean up the house, although it was not dirty. "I just wanted to do something, and not sit, immersed in sad thoughts about the fate of the girl." However, it didn't take long to clean up. Jane came to visit, who, as it turned out a little later, was a good friend of Fedor's wife, and was already privy to the details of everything that happened at night and in the morning. The neighbor began to lament. Yesterday I spent the night with my daughter. And here on our street I missed such an event. As a friend told me that a foundling had been found, my heart almost stopped. What kind of mother could do such a thing, cuckoo? There are no other words. It's necessary to leave a child in the cold. Ugh. The woman, having spoken, reached into her bag, took out a package, and handed it to the surprised Helga, explaining. I collected this for your hero." Looking at him, I scolded him and called him a parasite. And it turns out he saved the child. After sitting a little longer and discussing the details of the unusual incident several times, Jane got ready to go home, saying, "Now the times have come. It seems like everything is in bulk, and the children are thrown away like some kind of garbage. Being in an orphanage is like a punishment without guilt. No matter what anyone says, life there is not easy. I know it from myself." The woman fell silent and, brushing away uninvited tears, said goodbye to Helga and left. Frodo looked with an understanding look, as if he was looking into the depths of his owner's soul, and she admitted to the dog, "Imagine, I think I would like the girl you found to stay with us. Why, you get along great with children. And I'm already at such an age that it's high time to become a mother. You and I worked out our practice on children excellently, in my opinion. So they could definitely handle one girl." By chance, or perhaps truly understanding the mistress, Frodo winked, and the touched woman hugged her faithful dog. During an evening conversation, Helga told her daughter-in-law about the girl she had found and asked, "You seem to have mentioned once that one of your classmates is raising a foster child. Maybe you happen to know how the adoption procedure goes?" Lily, it turned out, was not too surprised by the question and promised to find out all the important nuances. The next day, Helga came to work and tried to act as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. However, my thoughts stubbornly returned to the found baby and everything connected with her. Helga did not understand what reason could be good enough to abandon a child on the street in the cold. And she was so immersed in her thoughts that, while working on the nails of one of the regular visitors, she incorrectly answered the questions asked and almost ruined the drawing. As luck would have it, the owner was in the salon that day, who noted the insecure work of the master and, after the client left, invited Helga to a conversation in her small office. "What kind of nonsense have you allowed yourself to eat? Yesterday I didn't go out at all, but today it's like you're holding instruments in your hands for the first time. I understand everything. There may be personal problems. We are all human. But when troubles begin to affect the quality of work, this is unacceptable. Nowadays, there is such competition among nail service professionals that there is simply no right to make mistakes and send visitors away not completely satisfied. So Helga, I want to get an honest answer from you to a direct question. Will you be able to cope with your emotions and work normally? Or should I look for another master at the salon?" Helga had to briefly brief her boss on what had happened, and she unexpectedly softened her tone. "Oh, well, I would have explained it right away. Helping a child is sacred. I thought it was a sin that you were walking. She doesn't seem like a frivolous person, but you never know what happens in life. But still, Helga, pull yourself together. You did everything you could, and you have nothing to reproach yourself with." Unexpectedly, Helga opened up. "You know, I gave the girl to the specialists, it seems, but my heart is restless. I feel some kind of responsibility or something." The insightful Alice clarified. "Aren't you going to adopt her? Keep in mind, this is not taking a dog or a kitten into the house. The hassle is many times greater. True, the return is incomparable, but you need to think about everything extremely seriously. I'll tell you in advance, so that there is no misunderstanding between us. I won't put you on maternity leave. You understand, this is not my practice. But at home, as far as I understand, things are slowly going well for you. Yes, I'll be sorry to part with you, but I won't keep my place for you. No offense, of course. There is constant turnover in salons. There is no escape from it. So maybe it will be possible to find a job for you with a break, but I won't make any promises. In general, your decision should be fully informed." There was a knock on the boss's office. Administrator Lena came in and apologized and said, "Alice." There, the visitor arrived a little earlier than she had been booked in, and behaved rather nervously. I offered her coffee, but she insists that she get a manicure as soon as possible, as if she expected us to lay out the red carpet for her and greet her with applause. But suddenly they offered her food. Alice, dissatisfied and gloomily, besieged the administrator. "Keep your thoughts about visitors to yourself, it will be better." Turning her head to Helga, the boss summed up the conversation. "I think you understood what I said. Then go and work." Helga hurried to her workplace and got down to business that brought her both money and pleasure. She appreciated Alice's frankness, which gave a complete picture of the prospects in connection with the likely changes, and decided to really think through her idea of adopting the found girl in every detail. In the evening, Helga's brother's family came to visit Helga and her faithful Frodo. The joyful boys were busy with the dog, who was happy about the return of the children, whom he considered his charges, and tolerated all signs of attention from them. At this time, the adults were discussing the details of the incident. Denny, looking straight into his sister's eyes, asked, "Helga, as I understand it, you regret that the girl ended up in a state-owned house and would like to adopt her. You've always had a kind heart, but don't you think this is too much? You, of course, have experience communicating with Max and Alex. But that doesn't mean anything. Who knows what problems the baby will have?" Lily echoed her husband and provided valuable information. Adoption is not a simple procedure at all. The documents required are through the roof. When my friend read out the list, my hair stood on end. I briefly outlined the situation and realized that it was not in vain. A friend who passed through the bureaucratic cordon immediately explained that you have at least 3 complicating circumstances at once. First of all, you are not married. And although according to the law this is not a basis for refusing adoption, in reality it may be considered that this is not in favor of the child. Secondly, you want to adopt a specific girl. In general, it turns out that there is a waiting list for small, healthy children. It may well turn out that by the time you collect all the necessary information, the girl will already be in the family. Thirdly, although in fact this is the most important, you don't have the necessary space of your own. George, and the share in our apartment will most likely not be enough. Noticing that Helga was sad, Lily rushed to support her. If you are firmly ready to fight for the girl, then Denny and I consulted and decided that I could issue you a deed of gift for this house. Seeing that his sister was about to burst into tears with emotion, Denny hastened to defuse the situation. However, as an option, you can urgently find a groom without material and housing problems and quickly get married. So 2 out of 2 problems will be solved with one graceful act, at least formalizing the fake marriage. Helga smiled through her tears. Well, this is some kind of fantastic option. It seems to me that it is absurd to count on him. Lily agreed. It's easier to become the mistress of this house anyway. I would never dare to give it into the wrong hands, and so he will actually remain in the family. I think my aunt would be happy. Having officially received a complete list of documents required for adoption, Helga began to obtain all the necessary certificates. She learned the wisdom at the school of foster parents, ran to doctors to pass a medical examination, visited various offices, and took a reference from her boss and a certificate of income. In addition, at the prompting of Lily and a friend, Helga asked the policeman to write a petition with a brief history of the discovery of the child, and Fedor did not refuse. In addition, thanks to a good relationship with the wife of the district police officer, he, in some unknown way, contributed to the fact that Helga was allowed to visit the found girl in the baby's home. Communication with the baby, who was named Diane, became a real miracle for the woman. She held the girl in her arms and was touched. Emotions were reflected on the small face. Even when Diane frowned or began to grunt with displeasure, Helga admired the baby. The nannies were accustomed to visits from the woman, who brought things not only for her pet, but also for other children, and sometimes they allowed her to stay with the girl longer. Although many employees have experienced some burnout over the many years of work at the baby house, they could not help but be happy that Diane, it seems, will soon find her mother. Every time Helga met a neighbor on the street, she sincerely thanked her for her help and support and offered to give her, her daughter, and her granddaughter a free manicure. Jane, they waved it off. Come on, Helga. How can I stay on the sidelines when there is practically a struggle for a child right next to me? I cannot. Let the girl have a chance to quickly become your daughter. No one deserves to end up in an orphanage, and I will help in any way I can. Thank God I have lived in the world and understand people. Fedor is a normal guy. My wife told him what kind of person you were, and that was enough for him. In general, don't worry and don't make things up. We'll have to contact you, but not for free. The money will still be useful to you. Jane and everyone who was aware of the situation tried to support her. Denny and Lily brought children's clothes, which were too small for Max and Ilya, but were in almost perfect condition. The colors, of course, are not particularly girlish, but everything is good. And the Helga ska is very maneuverable and light. Helga did not know how to thank her brother, and especially her daughter-in-law, who provided her with housing and with a generous gesture turned her into a well-to-do lady. Now the inspectors had no chance to reproach the woman for not being able to provide her adopted daughter with decent living conditions. Having run around and collected a set of necessary documents, Helga, with a restless heart, went to the guardianship and trusteeship department. The woman sincerely spoke about her experiences about the found girl, and that contact had already been established between them. Diane is happy when she sees me, smiles, wanders with her eyes, follows me when I leave. And in general, from the first moment, when I took her in my arms on a frosty night, I had the feeling that Diane was my blood. I may not have given birth to her, but I feel a real kinship with her. However, the story did not touch the hearts of strict officials one bit. I don't think that your decision to adopt a child is serious. I understand that you are single now, but you might meet a man. And what then? What if he doesn't need your daughter? What decision will you make then? Will you hand her back like a boring toy and stay with a man? And years later, will you constantly reproach your daughter for not building your own feminine happiness because of her? I think you need to think again. It will be better for everyone. People who have experienced severe loss spend years mulling over the decision to adopt a child. And you just decided since you found it, then the girl should a priori belong to you. This is strange, don't you think? The woman still said something, but Helga, stunned by the refusal, no longer understood much of the meaning of her phrases. There was a noise in her head, and after awkwardly saying goodbye, she left the office because it was the turn of other applicants. As promised, Helga called Lily and told her about the negative result of her visit to the guardianship and trusteeship department. The daughter-in-law supported. My friend warned me that most likely I would have to go through a trial, but don't be afraid, this is normal practice. By the way, think again, maybe you were really excited? Try to deal with your desire without unnecessary emotions, because this is a very big responsibility. Helga said wearily. Yes, as much as I was thinking, I hardly sleep at night, almost without a break. I think around the clock whether I can give poor Diane the real motherly love and care she deserves. So far, my opinion is clear. She will definitely be better off in a family than in a government institution, where the staff most likely does not have enough time for such poor fellows. The employees there are good, but they can't give in to everyone. Well then, don't be sad. Let's use all our resources and victory will be ours. The conversation calmed Helga down quite a bit, and although she was afraid that insomnia would overcome her again that night, she fell asleep almost immediately after returning home and walking with Frodo. The woman even forgot about food. And it's good that the alarm clock on the smartphone was set in advance for the required time of getting up. However, this precaution was even unnecessary. The faithful dog, obeying some natural feeling, woke up the owner a few minutes before the nasty bell rang. Helga had to tell Alice about the failure, and the boss surprisingly provided her subordinate with moral support. I admit, I somehow admire your determination to fight for a girl you don't know. It's a pity that your running around the authorities has so far been without result. After all, as far as I understand, this means that the schedule will have to be rearranged again. Well, nothing. I think the girls will cooperate. I have plans to open a location in the area where you live, and as soon as all the formalities are ready, they will transfer you there. I warn you right away, the salary at first may be less than here. But I think there are prospects for improvement. Helga, inspired by the support of her boss, went to her workplace. A transfer to a new location could actually make her life much easier and save valuable time that she is currently spending on the road. However, for now it was necessary to act precisely in the circumstances that prevailed at the moment. Helga, whose income had noticeably decreased while running around various authorities, tried to save money, but still could not deny herself the pleasure of looking into the children's departments whenever possible to look for things for her future daughter. She had no doubt that, even through court, or even several court hearings, she would be able to achieve her goal. Once, in a special department located in a large shopping center, a woman, turning into an aisle with toys, almost collided head-on with her ex. Andrew was noticeably embarrassed and tried to hide his emotions behind a cheeky tone. "Hello, what fate are you? Are you picking up anything for your nephews? Or is there something I don't know about you?" The man, following his habit, smoothed his hair with his palm, and Helga noticed the sparkling rim of a brand new wedding ring on his finger. The meeting with her former roommate stirred resentment in Helga's soul, and she did not even try to answer him politely. "Why do you need to know anything about me?" With the hands of his sister, he threw me out of the apartment into which I, like some fool, invested money. And now, one might think, you are interested in something? Go somewhere your own way, and don't stand in my way. Andrew was taken aback. He did not expect such a rebuke from Helga, who, from her experience living together, was distinguished by meekness, tenderness, and a tendency to compromise. A man who married out of pure convenience and fell under the control of a strict wife has already regretted that he followed the lead of his family and entered into this profitable, but clearly unhappy marriage. The years spent with Helga now seemed to him the most golden time of his life. He would not mind restoring a relationship with her and receiving love and understanding from his former partner, although he was worried about how to do everything so that his legal wife would not know about the affair. Andrew understood that in this case the costs of marriage would most likely be in vain, but whoever doesn't take risks, as you know, doesn't drink champagne. Thinking quickly, the man tried to soften his impression. "Sorry, Helga. I still think that you are the best thing that has happened to me in this life. Please forgive me for hurting you. I was wrong, and I wish I could go back in time and do things differently. But unfortunately, no one has yet invented a time machine." Andrew joked, trying to evoke positive emotions in his ex. But Helga grimaced as if she had bitten off a slice of lemon and admitted, "Andrew, I was also mistaken. It was not worth wasting time on you and money on your apartment. These funds would be very useful to me now. But what can we do now? Just spit and move on with your life. Okay, no need to waste my time again. Goodbye." Andrew tried to tell Helga something else, but she hastily left the department, and he did not dare to follow her. However, it seemed to him that he still had a chance to get his modest mistress back. After thinking a little, the man deposited money on Olia's card in the amount of about 2 of her salaries, hoping that this would begin their dialogue. He imagined how the proud woman would return the amount to him, and then gradually they would begin to communicate. But Andrew miscalculated. Helga really needed the money. And having received a message about their receipts, she immediately rushed to hire a good lawyer to conduct the trial. Lily helped find the specialist, who in turn learned about him from her friend who had gone through this unpleasant process. Surprisingly, the amount received was definitely enough for the fee. Helga saw this as a very good sign and was not mistaken. The lawyer brilliantly defended the interests of her and the found baby. At the beginning of the summer, after almost 8 months of struggle for Diane, the girl was officially recognized as her daughter, and a completely new stage in their lives began. Alice, whose opening of a new salon was delayed, suggested that the employee go on paid leave for the first time. This, of course, is not a decree, but I think everything will be resolved successfully soon. You will be able to find a nanny for the girl while you work. Helga smiled happily. "Thank you very much, Alice. I have so many helpers. Just a miracle. The daughter-in-law and the boys have arrived for the summer, and the neighbors are vying with each other to offer help." The stern boss smiled. "Well, that's just wonderful. So, as soon as there is news, I will call you about the arrival of little Diane home." Helga organized a small celebration for the closest people who provided great support on the way to the goal. In addition to her brother and family, Jane and the district police officer along with her wife were invited. Those gathered tried not to make noise, and Max and George, in the company of their tailed friend, were almost constantly in the room where their new relative was quietly sleeping in the crib. Helga warmly thanked everyone who helped in her difficult task. "Consider this a little belated gift, but what a gift. Now you have a daughter, and she has you. I wish you both good health, and so that you always understand each other and be happy." After a pleasant evening, Helga, her brother's family, and little Diane remained in the house. The smart dog lay down not in his favorite chair, but right next to the baby's crib. Max ran to the adults and showed them this touching picture. "Look, Diane now has a personal nanny." Lily hugged her son tenderly. "Frodo guarded you and your brother. And while talking with you, I realized how to treat children. It's quite normal that he took the baby under his wing. Such a smart dog is simply not capable of doing anything differently." With the advent of her adopted daughter, Helga seemed to have a second wind. Lily sometimes jokingly said, "Listen, it seems like you don't even need help. You get up before everyone else, have time to clean the house and take care of the boys and daughter. It's like I'm relaxing here at a resort." Although at the stage of collecting documents for adoption, people who knew about the situation tried to warn Helga and repeatedly tried to tell her that the girl may have hidden pathologies. The fears turned out to be unfounded. That's what the old paramedic said. The baby received excellent care right up until the moment she was thrown onto the street. The girl grew up and had practically no serious illnesses, so ordinary childhood ailments. And in terms of intelligence with age, she could give a head start not only to Ilya, but also to Max. The issue with work was also resolved perfectly. Alice managed to open a new salon, where she invited Helga to work. The journey from home to work and back now took very little time, and the woman was completely happy. One day Andrew called her, and in a trembling voice began to invite her on a romantic date. And Helga, listening to her former roommate, wondered how she could even fall in love with him. After saying goodbye and pressing end, she blocked the number that she once knew by heart and felt that she had now truly turned the page on the past completely. Even if Andrew turned out to be not entirely a scoundrel and transferred money for the repairs made, the woman still did not want to communicate with him. She had already spent part of her life on him and no longer wanted to give him even a few minutes. 5 years flew by unnoticed. Diane grew up smart and affectionate, refuting all doubts about bad heredity from the parents who abandoned her. Watching the girl reach for knowledge, Helga decided to enroll her daughter in preparatory courses at school. The meeting for parents had already passed, and the woman and Diane even managed to buy all the stationery that the teacher recommended. The first lesson was supposed to take place in a week. Changes were coming, but Helga still had no idea how large-scale they would be. In the meantime, we could enjoy the still warm evenings of the coming autumn. Twilight was in no hurry to drive away the daylight, and the woman, without fear, let her daughter walk in the yard in the company of Frodo. Helga had no doubt about the dog's prudence. And even if Diane had planned a dangerous prank, her faithful bodyguard would have prevented any trouble. One day, looking out the window, a woman saw her Diane talking with an unfamiliar man. The dog stood between the interlocutors, blocking the little mistress, but Helga's heart pinched unpleasantly. Anticipating danger, she hurriedly went down the steps of the stairs, stood next to the dog, the daughter of a stranger, and warily asked, "Good evening. Did you want something? Are you looking for someone?" The man, looking up from his careful examination of Diane, looked up at the woman and, trying not to scare anyone, said hello, introduced himself and explained, "Good evening. I'm Justin. Have you heard of such an entrepreneur from the neighboring region?" Helga shook her head and the man continued, "Apparently I need to talk with you about the events of almost 6 years ago. It so happens that it seems that you have perfectly solved the problem that you acquired because of a person close to me. There can be no excuse for what happened in the past, and I am indebted to you forever." Helga's legs almost gave way. She realized that the man had a direct relationship with the girl whom she raised as her own daughter, and frantically wondered what to do and how not to scare the little girl with unexpected information. Unable to think of anything better, the woman asked Diane, "Daughter, take the apples and take them to your grandmother together with Frodo. Sit there and entertain her a little." Otherwise, she complained that her relatives had not come, or to visit for a long time. "Play something, and in the meantime, I'll talk to our guest. Don't rush home. I'll come for you myself." The girl looked sternly at the man and asked with narrowed eyes, "And you won't offend my mother?" Justin put his hand to his heart and promised, "I won't offend you for anything." Diane hesitated for a few seconds, and then turned to the dog. "Frodo, let's go to Grandma. I'll just carry the apples, otherwise I know you. You won't be able to carry half of them." The dog, who adored his owner, only waved his tail in response. Helga watched Diane and the dog go out the gate and invited an unexpected visitor. "Why are we standing on the street? Let's at least go to the veranda. Otherwise I feel the conversation will be long." There was a table and chairs on Helga's veranda, and the woman suggested, "Sit down and tell me. Otherwise my nerves are already on edge." The man did not refuse the offer, and sitting on a chair, told a story that made Helga feel uncomfortable. "In the past, my family and I lived in a neighboring state, 300 kilometers from your town. My wife, Margaret, gave birth to my daughter, Dorothy. Beautiful, healthy. I tried to make life easier for the woman I love. We also had an au pair. She did the cleaning and cooking. More precisely, she was an old friend of my mother and practically part of our family. This woman raised me and treated me, if not like a son, then like an adored nephew. Aunt Isabel and Margaret received her very warmly, and she really doted on her daughter. Everything was great. Both the house and the business are well promoted, and with prospects for development right up to the capital. In general, I was so successful that my competitors decided to destroy me, not physically. No, not at all. On the other hand, they approached him in order to hit him harder. They wanted to trample him mentally. And for me, this was worse than death. As I found out completely after the fact, a person was hired who studied all the information about my wife, found an approach to her, and then began a secret affair with her. It's probably a banal story. But being in this whole situation is so disgusting that all the comedy is not even felt. I would almost not blame my wife for her affair, if not for the sad consequences. One day I received photographs by email in which my wife and a man I didn't know were having fun. At first I just wanted to break her neck, but I pulled myself together to do the irreparable and instructed a good friend to check if the pictures were real. You never know, maybe it's editing. But the timid hope was dashed by reality. Margaret did have some fun on the side. Moreover, the pictures were definitely fresh, because they showed a tattoo that she had done quite recently. Of course, it's also my fault that my wife fell for it and cheated on me. I was always missing at work. One issue urgently needed to be resolved, then another. Of course, Aunt Isabel took care of the household chores, but it was my support that Margaret needed. It was this thirst for warmth and participation that this scoundrel caught her. I don't know how I was able to survive the betrayal then. I spoke harshly to Margaret, but within the law, without assault. She cried, promised that she would break off the connection, which jeopardized our marriage. I loved her very much then and decided to give her another chance, without even realizing that this would be a huge mistake. About a week after Margaret and I had an unpleasant conversation, and we seemed to agree to try to save our marriage, she disappeared along with her daughter. Aunt Isabel's wife told her that she needed to go to the children's clinic for a scheduled appointment, and she left home. This has happened before. Therefore, there was no reason not to release them. When Margaret and Dorothy did not return for dinner, Aunt Isabel became worried and began calling my wife to find out if it would make sense to reheat the food. But the phone was unreachable. Even then, there was no alarm. Aunt Isabel told me that Margaret and her daughter seemed to be late at the clinic, where appointments are usually on time and there should be no queues. And she asked to go there, saying that her heart was not in the right place. I rushed and found out that Margaret and her daughter had not appeared there at all. That's when I got worried. While driving along the route to the house, I was looking through my email and, having opened a letter demanding money and naturally a ban on contacting law enforcement agencies, I almost got into an accident by sharply slamming on the brakes. I did not officially contact the police. I was very afraid that I was being watched or wiretapped. And as best I could, I calmly drove to the house, and through Aunt Yu, whom I sent away from the house, fearing the wiretapping, I contacted a good friend so that he could help unofficially investigate the disappearance of his wife and daughter. He advised me to agree to all demands, and I did everything exactly according to the instructions of the criminals, and began to wait for news. I believed that I could make up for this money. But terrible information came. The police department called me and informed me that they had found Margaret's burnt-out car. There were 2 bodies inside an adult woman and a baby. An examination followed. It was established that both lasting bodies belonged to my own girls. Aunt Isabel had a heart attack, and as a result, almost on the same day, 3 people, without whom I could not imagine my existence, ended up in their graves. I then began to get drunk almost every day, and some kind of supernatural anger helped me not to completely slide to the very bottom. I wanted to find the people responsible for the deaths of Margaret, Dorothy, and Aunt Isabel. But it was no use. The man seemed to have disappeared. My ill-wishers seemed to calm down. They even expressed sympathy. But running the business became completely uninteresting to me, and I sold it. Almost for next to nothing. You could say that he gave most of the money to charity, and he gradually began to learn to move on with his life. Justin fell silent, and Helga became perplexed. If the examination found that his wife and daughter died, it turns out that Diane cannot be involved in this tragic story. Why then did the man come to them? Was the expert mistaken, and the visitor buried someone else instead of his wife and daughter? The man seemed to have considered these unvoiced questions in Helga's eyes, because he spoke again and startled the woman with his confession. You seem to have already guessed that the girl you are raising is my daughter. Helga involuntarily began to shake her head, unable to say anything. And Justin, Realizing that it was difficult for a woman to accept such news, gently began to tell him further. With difficulty, with the support of my parents, who themselves could barely hold on after the news of the death, but I stopped drinking. Although he changed his field of activity, he went back to business. What else did I have left? I didn't want to upset my parents, so as not to lose them. This is how I spent these endlessly long years, stretching from the moment I last saw my wife and daughter. I never became close to a single woman, fearing betrayal. And 2 days ago, returning from work, I saw a female figure at the gate of the house. I was surprised after all. Strangers usually don't wander around our ranch. I thought that maybe one of the neighbors' housekeepers or nannies needed something. He drove up and got out of the car. I come closer, and it's Margaret herself standing in front of the gate. She was emaciated. There were bruises under her eyes covering half her face. But undoubtedly my wife appeared before me, swaying. Of course, I was afraid for my own mind, suspecting that I had gone crazy. I went to visit my wife and daughter at the cemetery, and then suddenly there was such a turn. Margaret fell to her knees in front of me and began to beg for conversion, but I had no time for these sentiments. What worried me more was not even the fact that under the name of my wife, some other woman had found her last refuge in the churchyard. The most important thing for me was to find out why Margaret returned alone and where my daughter went. I dragged my wife into the house and began asking questions. And the more she talked, the worse I felt. It turns out that on the day of her disappearance, Margaret went to meet her lover, but not for fun. The man decided to get money from my wife using a video that he shot secretly and promised to post on all available networks in order to disgrace her, and at the same time undermine my business reputation. How Margaret cried when she said that she decided to take Dorothy with her, so that after meeting her lover she could drop into the clinic. The scoundrel decided to up the ante and said plans had changed. The money that Margaret brought was not enough for him. He demanded that she live in one of the houses as a living toy. Neither tears, nor pleas, nor promises of money could bribe this cynic. The only thing my wife could agree on was to save her daughter. So that the baby could not be recognized, she was changed, and her lover allowed Margaret's note to be printed on a printer, but not written by hand. Moreover, he strictly warned that if the text contains a hint of the name of the girl or her parents, then Dorothy will not survive. Laughing, he said that he would not feel sorry for the child. Frightened Margaret, of course, agreed to everything. She, naive, thought that I would certainly look for my daughter. And I didn't know that a lot of people were involved in this, and that false cases had already been prepared and the expertise was bought on the vine. Margaret was in some country hotel, and she was entertaining the crowd. And a week ago I managed to escape and get home. She may be exhausted with obvious health problems, but she accomplished the almost impossible and gave me hope. After listening to my wife's story, I realized that our daughter might be alive. We had to bring heaven to earth, but we managed to find the bribed expert and even get on the trail of the found little girl, about the same age as our Dorothy. It's good that Margaret roughly figured out how long they had been traveling before Dorothy was taken from her. It's just a miracle that you haven't moved anywhere. Otherwise, the search would have been delayed. It will probably be difficult for the girl to accept the truth, but Margaret and I are her parents. In fairness, it is we who must educate and raise her. We, of course, want to offer you compensation. We'll pay you any amount you name. Helga felt bad only in her worst dreams. People came to her and tried to take Diane away. A woman would jump up screaming from such visions, invariably frightening the sensitive Frodo, and sometimes even her adopted daughter, who was generally known to sleep soundly. And now the nightmare is happening in reality, and it's impossible to wake up. The silence that settled on the veranda dragged on, and then Helga went on a tirade. Do you want to know what compensation will suit me? I'll tell you, simply leave me and my daughter Diane alone. I don't need anything more from you. Let me raise my daughter in peace, and don't dare interfere in our lives. A baby is not a toy. And for that matter, your wife has no excuse. Why the hell did she go there with her little daughter? It was clear that she was going towards the criminal. Again, this man of hers could easily do anything to the girl, and how would your thick-headed wife control him? Oh, he allowed her to print the letter. What a benefactor. Do you know that your daughter was planted under that apple tree for me? Frosty night. Did you see the dog that stood in front of your daughter? It was he who sensed that someone had appeared in the yard. If it weren't for him, it's scary to even think what would have happened to the baby. She was essentially left to the mercy of fate. Will it freeze or not? Do you think I'll give you my daughter so calmly? What for? No, I will fight and will definitely win. We are used to exchanging everything for money. Everything is for sale. Do you think you just need to name the price and you can calmly ruin fate? Who do you think you are? Helga took a breath and realized that businessmen have much more opportunities. She was frightened by the prospect of being left without a daughter and began to convince the man. You are an adult, and you understand that it will be difficult for a girl to change something in life. How can I explain to her that she will now have 2 mothers? Diane grew up in my arms. She's used to me and loves me. Can you imagine how much harm this unexpected news could cause her? Please, let's leave everything as it is. I tell you, Helga, no need to shock Diane. Please, if your daughter is dear to you, spare her. Don't ruin her fate. Of course you are running a business, and they are better off financially apparently. But is it just about money? Justin wanted to object, but at that moment his phone rang so loudly that Helga even flinched from the ringing. She saw how the man turned pale, almost silently listening to his interlocutor, and guessed that the complicated tragic story had received an unexpected continuation. At the end of the conversation, Justin roared, "So you were completely powerless? Is this what you want to tell me?" The voice from the receiver monotonously explained something, and Helga could hear the words. "We sympathize. Sorry, we did everything we could." The woman realized that something irreparable had happened, and Justin, who ended the conversation, confirmed her assumption. Margaret died. This time there can be no mistake. I put her in the hospital with a doctor I knew so that they could treat her, at least give her some vitamins, and she, after being there for a while, just went out the window. Doctors tried to save Margaret, but her body was too exhausted. She was given anesthesia, she just fell asleep. Her heart stopped beating. Justin looked confused, and compassionate Helga brought him water and a sedative from her personal supplies. "Here, take this medicine, you will feel better." The man thanked him in confusion and got up to leave. However, before reaching the door a few steps, he turned to Helga and asked, "Let's postpone the continuation of this conversation. I will arrive in 4 days, having previously agreed on a time convenient for you, and then we will decide what to do." Helga looked after Justin, and only when he got into the car parked at the beginning of the street, she hurried to her neighbor to get Diane, whom, it turns out, her parents called Dorothy. Frodo noticed the mistress in advance and opened the unlocked door for her. And Jane, who was happily playing checkers with the girl, immediately noticed that Olia had no face. After waiting for Diane to leave, Jane asked in a whisper, "What kind of guy came to see you? Ex yours or what? I really wanted to call Fyodor so that he would look at you by chance." Helga, who herself still couldn't believe the sudden turn of fate, did not tell her neighbor anything, limiting herself to gratitude for helping to keep the girl occupied and a promise. "I'll tell you everything later, but now we'll go. I'm kind of tired today." On the way home, Helga squeezed Diane's hand so tightly that she even playfully asked, "Mom, are you afraid that, like ours, one day I'll take a balloon and fly away?" The woman almost burst into tears, but tried not to let the girl notice her depressed mood. "Sorry, Diane, I was just lost in thought." Helga spent the whole night without sleep. She looked on the internet for all the information she could find about Justin, and was surprised that practically no sharply negative statements were published about him. Most of the articles were, of course, devoted to the misfortune that happened to his wife and daughter. Helga looked closely at the posted photos, but from the small images, and even in poor resolution, it was almost impossible to make out whether Diane or another child was in them. In the morning, after taking her daughter to kindergarten, the woman rushed to visit her daughter-in-law, warning her at work that she would be late for an hour. Lily, after listening to her, was silent for a long time, and then supported her relative. "Diane is officially your daughter. Perhaps her father can go to court. But it seems to me it is better to try to resolve the matter peacefully," Helga admitted. "Lily, I'm incredibly scared. Maybe I should just drop everything, take Diane and go somewhere, so that her father will never find us?" The daughter-in-law nipped the idea of running away in the bud, without even hearing to the end what country Helga had decided to leave for. "In my opinion, doing this will only complicate everything. You say that this Justin will come to you in 4 days. This means it will be approximately Saturday, so that's great. Denny and I are also present at this meeting. And it would also be a good idea to invite the lawyer who helped Diane win the case. When Justin called Helga and they agreed on a time to meet, the woman realized that there was nowhere to retreat. The businessman, to the surprise of the woman, her brother, daughter-in-law, and lawyer, arrived alone for the fateful negotiations. He had several large packages in his hands. Having met and shook hands with the men, Justin explained the contents of his burden. These are all gifts for my daughter. After everyone was settled, the businessman began negotiations that were more difficult than he had ever conducted. Helga, I am immensely grateful to you for preventing Dorothy, let me call her that, from staying in a government institution for a long time. I am ashamed that I believed in the results of the examination and did not double-check them. After all, having done this, the search for my daughter would not have been stopped, and we would have met with her much earlier. I've been thinking all these days, and he made a difficult decision. Let's not shock the girl. You, Helga, were absolutely right when you said that the truth would only bring her suffering. Let everything remain as it is. I have only one request. Under any pretext, allow me to come and visit my daughter. I won't bother you often, but at least on weekends. Let's go somewhere together. The lawyer, realizing that his services would not be needed, hurried to leave, and Justin, Denny, Helga, and Lily sat, thinking a little more about how to introduce Diane to her father. As a man who cares about the beauty of his nails and comes in for a manicure, or as a colleague, Lily came up with a brilliant idea. Oh, what's there to invent? Justin, come as a fan. Then gifts for Diane would be appropriate. Everyone agreed on this option. And Lily's idea turned out to be very promising. In the process of communication, sincere sympathy arose between Helga and Justin. A year after they met, which began with extreme stress, they got married, and the man legally became the father of his own daughter. A little later, he resolved all the issues in his hometown and moved to Ole and Diane to always be close to those he loves. Emily, a third grader, came home from school with a snowman in her hands that was so small it fit in the palm of her hand. She quickly stuffed the snowman into the freezer, delighted with her ingenuity. She wanted to please her mother, who had been sad and tired at work lately. She worked as a janitor in a huge office where every little thing was scrutinized. In addition, Emily recently learned that her mother, Sarah, is secretly in love with her boss, Frederick Ives. The daughter accidentally overheard her mother talking to her friend. Gee, Sarah, the friend marveled, you have to fall in love like that. After all, he's your boss, and you're just a simple cleaning lady. This Frederick is a real handsome man. A good-looking man. A man of fortune. He doesn't even notice people like us. Be careful. You might get burned one of these days. I know, Tess, I'm not stupid. I'm not stupid, Sarah sighed. But you can't help what your heart tells you to do. Have you confessed your feelings to him yet? Tess asked. No, of course not. Have you what? Sarah exclaimed. Who am I and who is he? I'd be laughed at by those office hotties if they knew. And Frederick Ives himself doesn't think I'm anything. I'm like a pesky fly to him. When I go into his office to clean, he wrinkles his nose and walks away. Oh, my advice to you, my dear. Keep your love to yourself, Tess worried. However, there may be trouble. You have a daughter in your arms, after all. Don't forget that. When Emily went into the kitchen to get some candy, her friends were silent, pretending that nothing had happened. But Emily heard everything. And so in her pretty little head a plan matured, how to get a daddy. Little Emily dreamed of a father as soon as she went to the kindergarten and saw that the other children had not only moms, but also dads who took their kids sledding, made snowballs and drove cars. And the dads were also strong, and that's what her mom lacked. The girl reached out to her dads. She often stood nearby, listening to fathers interacting with their children. This drew the jealousy of the other children upon her. Get out of here. That's my daddy, shouted Mike one day, and shoved 4-year-old Emily painfully. Mike, you can't do that. You're a man, said his father, and took the crying Emily in his arms. Are you hurt bad? I apologize to my son for being rude. The tears dried instantly. It was the first time she'd ever been in the arms of a daddy, even a stranger, and it felt good. Mom once asked, Emily, how come other kids have a daddy and I don't but Sarah? Instead of answering her daughter's direct question, burst into tears right in front of Emily. She gave her a great fright. From then on, the little girl never touched the subject of her father again. She knew with her childish instinct that this question would hurt her beloved mother. But now that her mother had fallen in love, the girl had a real chance to have a father who will become their support in life and will love them both. At least that's what they showed in all the family movies, and Emily was determined to take that chance by all means. Emily, the teacher called out. "You're in the clouds again. Tell me the answer to the problem." But Emily stood by her desk, blushing with embarrassment. Her daydreaming had caused her to sit through half of her math class. At recess, Sophie, whom Emily had been friends with since first grade, approached her. "Oh, you're going to get in trouble for getting an F," Sophie sympathized. "Why didn't you solve the problem?" The answer was, "There are 2 diggers left. I just wondered," Emily admitted. "My mom's in love, I found out by accident. So here I am wondering how to get that uncle to hook up with my dad. My mom won't tell him anything, but that she loves him, you know. You're the lucky one. You've had a dad all your life, but I never had one. Mommy cries about it all the time. By the way, our dad wanted to leave us," Sophie blurted out, who apparently couldn't keep the family secret anymore. "I'm going to tell you something now, but you don't tell anyone else. Understand?" And seeing Emily nod, she took her girlfriend aside. "When Mom found out Dad had fallen out of love with us, she cried a lot too. And then she went to this powerful sorceress or fortune teller. So she made Daddy fall back in love with Mommy. He didn't love his aunt at his job. And that was it. Now we're like we used to be. But it's a secret," Sophie blabbed. "You're not my friend anymore." "Wow, how do you find that sorceress?" Emily was trembling with anticipation. "Well, let me get you the address tomorrow," Sophie promised. "Don't you worry, you'll have a daddy." The girls hugged each other and went to class. Now Emily had nothing to stop her from listening to the teacher. She was full of hope and joy. The next day, Sophie brought the address, neatly written down on a piece of paper. For her help, Emily gave her friend her favorite teddy bear, which Sophie had long liked. In short, both parties were satisfied. After school, she went straight to the sorceress, taking with her a picture of her mother and Frederick Ives. The fortune teller lived not far from the school, so Emily made it on foot fairly quickly. The snow swirled, covering the paths, but the girl persevered, wanting to reach her dream. And here showed the green roof of a small, beautiful house, surrounded by an open-work fence. Emily opened the gate, went into a small yard where there were planted miniature fir trees, which created a New Year's atmosphere. Emily paused for a moment and admired the manicured garden. Suddenly, the door opened. A young woman in her 30s with beautifully styled hair and discreet makeup, wearing a white sweater, fashionable jeans, and Uggs appeared on the threshold. She looked questioningly at her guest. "Looks more like a snowman than a child," the woman thought. Emily stared at her and couldn't think of anything better to do than crouch down in a curtsy. "Hello, little buddy," smiled the woman, who was amused by the child's antics. "Looking for something here? Are you lost?" "Hello," Emily said. "Hello." "No, I'm not lost. I came here on purpose, looking for a sorceress who can do fortune-telling and stuff. Does she live here?" Here the landlady looked confused. "And would you call her, please? I really need her help," asked Emily. "So it's me," the stranger admitted. "And what do you need me for?" "Wait, it's you," Emily wondered. "Are sorceresses like that? They have a hooked nose, wispy hair, and a big wart on their cheek. They're also hunchbacked and old and senile, and you're young for a witch." Hearing the childish reasoning, the woman laughed. She definitely liked this brave little girl. "Apparently you really need help, since you weren't afraid to come to the scary old woman," she smiled. "I hate to break it to you, but the sorceress you're looking for is standing right in front of you. No scary old women in my household. Come on, what's the point of freezing inside?" Emily liked it immediately. Crystal lights, light-colored walls and furniture made the interior airy, and the large flowers and floor pots gave the impression of a beautiful garden. On the sofa lay a large cat, who half-idly watched the entrance. "How beautiful you have it," Emily gasped. "And I thought it would be dark and dirty here. Cobwebs everywhere. A big stove with a huge black cauldron. Yep, maybe there's also a broom in the corner that I fly on," laughed the woman again. "Well, you've been reading a lot of fairy tales. You've read too many fairy tales. What's your name?" "My name is Jessica Smith." "Jessica is a beautiful name. It must be nice to be called that." "And my name is Emily," the guest replied, looking around. "Wow, what a kitty. And I asked my mom for a cat, but she won't let me have one. She says it's not enough to clean because of her, but I'll help and clean the litter box and feed it." She doesn't believe me. While Emily was lamenting the absence of a cat in her life, Jessica Smith brought hot tea, sandwiches, and sweets. "Here, have some. You must be hungry. I don't have children here, but the goodies are available. I like them myself." "Oh, thank you," Emily cheered. She was really hungry. While Emily was getting her treats, Jessica Smith got a better look at her. The girl's clothes were rather shabby, indicating the family's lack of money, but the blouse and skirt were neat. It was obvious that Emily's house was kept clean. Unwittingly, Jessica Smith remembered her childhood, and therefore felt for this spontaneous little girl who had fallen on her head like a snowball. "So, Emily, tell me about it. What are you here for? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Jessica Smith asked as her guest finished her tea and patted herself contentedly on her stomach. "I haven't had a dad my whole life," Emily began to recount confusingly, causing the sorceress to smile involuntarily. "And recently my mom fell in love with my uncle. and he doesn't know about it. You wouldn't think it. My mom is very beautiful, but she has to work as a cleaning lady because they won't take her anywhere else. She used to work in an atelier, making beautiful dresses, but then they closed it down. I like this skirt. Seeing Jessica Smith nod her head, Emily continued her story. And yesterday, a friend told me that her mom has fallen in love with her husband again, so I was wondering if you, the witch, Jessica Smith, make the boss love mom and marry her. And then I'll have a daddy too. Does mommy know you came to see me? Jessica Smith asked, amazed at the little girl's intentions. No, it's a surprise, replied Emily. Can you imagine how great it will be when Uncle Frederick wants to marry her? I want so much to see Mama happy. Will you help me? I don't even know what to tell you, said the landlady thoughtfully. How can I do anything without your mother's permission? Oh, and I need pictures of them. Oh, you don't think I'm just saying that? I'll pay for it. I've got some money. I've been saving my pocket money. Here it is, and Emily pulled out a purse with change. Jessica Smith could not resist such naive persuasion, and she liked this little girl who was old enough to be her granddaughter. I don't need your money. I can give it to you for free, you know. Let's say you've paid for your society. After all, I have a grown-up son, a big uncle, but he's not with me now. And he loved chocolate waffles as much as you did. Come on, let's see the pictures. We're gonna make a daddy for you real quick. Emily pulled out the cherished picture, printed on a plain sheet of paper, and handed it to Jessica Smith. When she took the photo, she was horrified. From the slightly blurred image stared back at her the man who had caused Jessica Smith's son to languish in prison. It was he, Frederick Ives, the traitor's son and thief. Jessica Smith's hands trembled. Emily slowly raised a stunned gaze to the woman who, by the look in her eyes, realized that something bad had happened. A silence hung in the air, which was broken by the shrewd girl. And why are you silent? Do you know him? My girl, said Jessica Smith, I can't tell you much, but I will tell you one thing. That man is evil himself. He's not just bad, he's horrible. And I'm not talking about his looks. I'm talking about his behavior, his actions. You're too young for me to tell you my secret, so don't take offense at me. But I know this man will bring any woman, even your mom, so much grief. It's better to live without a daddy than with a monster in the same house. Can he turn into a monster? Emily gasped. He can, but not for real, like in fairy tales, but in a figurative sense. You know, replied Jessica Smith, he's a scary person on the inside. Yeah, I get it, Emily frowned, mean, nasty, probably like our bully Max, who hurts everyone. Good for you, smiled the woman, laying out the solitaire. You're so small, but you think almost like an adult. Don't worry, your mom will find happiness. The road to it will be hard, so the cards say, but it's gonna be okay. Emily calmed down. I'll wait. You know what? Come visit me anytime, Jessica Smith offered. We'll chat and drink tea with you, okay? I'll do that, Emily said excitedly. It's not far from the school. The hostess gathered her a small bag of treats and walked her all the way to the gate. Emily gave Jessica Smith a hug, and she was surprised. It had been a long time since she had seen her son, and she had grown stale. But this little girl could warm her from the cold and loneliness. Emily left, and Jessica Smith stared after her for a long time. Left alone, she wondered how it was that fate had sent this innocent child to her, so that Jessica could protect the little girl and her mother. Just as Jessica had once failed to save her son. I'll help, Jessica Smith decided. In fact, she wasn't always a sorceress and hadn't practiced card divination before. Little Jessica was taught all these wisdoms by her gypsy grandmother, who saw in the girl a bit of her abilities. Grandmother Laura at one time abandoned the Tabor for a handsome military man, Jessica Smith's grandfather, but her magical abilities remained with her. Who knows, maybe that's why the calm, poised junior lieutenant rose to general. Grandma was feared by officers' wives when she lived in the barracks. They attributed all the troubles to her, from childhood whooping cough to accidents at firing ranges. What can you do? People are weak and used to blame anyone but themselves for their troubles. And the beautiful gypsy woman knew it very well. Here in her adored granddaughter Jessica, Laura from childhood taught to see through people, to scatter cards for divination, and learn the past and the future. And if the girl had tried harder, instead of learning all these wisdoms by rote, she would have become no less powerful seer than her grandmother. Why do I need all this? Jessica laughed as her grandmother made her learn the meaning of the cards. We live in the modern world, not the Middle Ages. This, as you say, nonsense will give you a piece of bread in hard times, Grandma replied seriously, and snapped her fingers in front of her granddaughter's nose. It's not black magic I'm teaching you. It's the simplest thing that every self-respecting gypsy woman should know, but I'm not a gypsy, Jessica argued. My hair is russet. Look, you're a gypsy since you have my blood in your veins. Laura was angry and threatened her granddaughter with her fist, so that the earrings around her neck shook. Learn what you're told. It will come in handy for you. What kind of naughty child is growing up? Now, remembering her grandmother over a cup of tea in her cozy home in the middle of a snowy street, Jessica Smith smiled involuntarily. How right you were, my sweet granny, she thought, but somehow she knew, and tears of sadness flowed from her eyes, whether it was because she was sorry for her bygone youth, or because her son was far away from her, or maybe it was both. When he was sent to prison on Frederick Ives' denunciation, Jessica didn't know what to do. Her hands sank with grief and the unbearable thought that her innocent son had been so cruelly punished for the treachery and theft of another man who had gone unpunished. But Frederick himself offered Alexander, Jessica's son, to create a firm where Alexander would be the president of the company and Frederick his assistant. Business was booming, the money flowed. But one not the best day for his son came to the police, taken away in the middle of the night, accused of non-payment of taxes and laundering huge sums. Alexander was in shock because the repayment of loans and taxes followed his assistant and comrade Frederick, who, as it later turned out Jessica Smith conducted her own investigation, was involved in a conspiracy against the owner of the company in order to seize it. But the police did not look into it thoroughly. The case, she was told, was closed, and no matter how hard her mother fought hiring lawyers, nothing changed. Frederick was backed by his powerful father, who of course knew all about it. Then Jessica Smith was fired from her job as an economist, arrogantly, on the grounds that she had embezzled from their accounts. Jessica realized who was behind it, and that was the final straw. Nicholas. She remembered her husband. Why did you leave this world so soon? It is hard to bear the blows of fate without you. Our son was taken away, and Jessica sank into depression. She didn't want to go out, didn't want to socialize with anyone. She neglected her household and only lay in bed until Grandma Laura came to her in a dream. "Come on, pull yourself together," Laura shouted at her granddaughter. "Why are you sagging like a wet rag? You need to be strong. You have a special gift, so use it. Remember what I taught you. Now go and eat. Build up your strength." Happiness must be fought for. Jessica Smith woke up from her sleep and was surprised to find herself sitting in the kitchen eating homemade sausage without bread. And there was nothing tastier than that homemade sausage. That's when Jessica decided to become a sorceress and fortune teller. As soon as she placed one ad, people came in droves. People wanted to know about their future. From then on, Jessica Smith's business was booming. She was earning many times more than in her previous job and could send good packages to her son in prison. She worried about Emily's fate. What if Frederick was up to some scam again and extreme the girl's mom? Jessica Smith had learned the nature of the scoundrel. He rubbed himself into a man's confidence and then put him in his place. You can do anything with a woman in love. She won't even notice because she'll be thinking with her heart, not her mind. So Jessica Smith made up her mind. She had to expose the crook so that his dirty deeds would be found out by his own employees and they would no longer trust him. She put on her best outfits and visited the best hair and makeup artist, then went to the office where Frederick and Emily's mom worked. "May I see Frederick Ives?" Jessica Smith asked sternly to the guard on duty. The guard had no problem letting the elegant woman into the supervisor's office, mistaking her for a relative or business associate. Frederick sat with his feet on the desk, watching a soccer game. "Hello, Frederick," she said, entering without knocking and purposely leaving the door open for others to hear. "And I see you're in your repertoire, taking a vacation while others work and are responsible for your progress." Oh, Frederick's eyes bulged as he saw the one he dreaded more than any other person in the world. "Good afternoon. What do you want? What can I do for you?"
"Let's see how you can help, dear Frederick," exclaimed the unhappy mother. "I want my son to get out of the prison into which he was put in your place. That is one thing. And you can help me by appearing before justice and taking his place. That's 2. And 3, you give the company to the rightful owner, Alexander Sokolovsky. My son."
"Security. Detain Jessica Smith's security. Take that woman out and never let her in here again," Frederick shouted. "Scream, scream, Frederick. Just know this. I've cursed you now. There will be no happiness for you." From this very moment, Jessica Smith shouted out, "By the way, I am a hereditary sorceress. Didn't you know that? You shouldn't have taken a swing at my family. I'm not afraid of any witches. It's all the nonsense of a crazy old woman," Frederick exclaimed. He discreetly spat over his left shoulder. When the guards came running in the person of an elderly officer on duty, they were afraid to hurt the witch for fear of a curse. But they didn't have to kick the woman out. Jessica Smith felt sick. Her heart couldn't take the strain, and she collapsed right into the guard's arms. "Get her out of here," Frederick shouted. "Where am I going to put her away?" "It's not trash. It's a human being," shouted the guard. "We should call an ambulance. Help, call an ambulance." But everyone stood and just stared at what was happening, afraid to move under the fierce gaze of the supervisor. Jessica Smith collapsed, collapsing on top of a guard who barely had time to pick her up. No one volunteered to help, and the hapless duty officer didn't know what to do. "Hello, ambulance," someone did call on the phone. "Come urgently. A woman here is not well. It must be her heart." Sarah ran into the office. Rushing over to the emotionless Jessica Smith, she unbuttoned her jacket and the collar of her blouse to make it easier to breathe. "There's a doctor coming now. Water. Give me water," the woman shouted. Someone handed over a carafe. Sarah scooped up a handful of cold water and splashed the injured woman's face and neck. "What's wrong with me? Where am I? Jessica Smith woke up. Who are you? I'm Sarah the cleaner, replied, and breathed a sigh of relief. I clean the floors here. What are you getting so excited about? You need to take care of yourself. Stay with me, Jessica Smith asked and looked at Sarah gratefully when she saw her nod her head in the affirmative. That's how they sat holding hands until the doctors arrived. If you don't leave now, consider yourself fired, and you may not come back, Frederick Ives told Sarah through gritted teeth. But that woman needs help, doesn't she? You can't just leave her. Just like that, Sarah wondered, not believing her ears. She had no idea about this dark side of her boss, so Sarah walked off to the ambulance. The stranger had caught her eye with something. Maybe it was the look of immeasurable grief in her eyes. Or maybe it was that she didn't want to be among those indifferent people who watched in silence as she felt sick. Jessica Smith was placed in a ward, and Sarah brought her own things from home, pajamas, slippers, and a robe. The rest of her personal supplies she bought on the way to the hospital. What a thoughtful daughter, said her roommates. She organized everything quickly. That's not my daughter. I just met her today, Jessica replied, much to her roommate's surprise. But she herself was very pleased to be in Sarah's care. Jessica Smith realized that Sarah was Emily's mother. Now I see who the little girl is, so smart, and she thought, and smiled. Why did you show up? Frederick Ives menacingly asked Sarah when she had just started cleaning the room. You're fired. Get out. The staff stopped work and watched in fear at the picture of the janitor's humiliation. No one stood up for her, afraid of losing their place in a company more like hard labor. You're firing me for saving a man, Sarah asked. What about you? If you got sick and everyone was standing there just goggle-eyed, how can you be so soulless? Switched to shouting, Sarah realized she had nothing more to lose. Fired without severance pay, shrieked Frederick Ives, unaccustomed to being rebuffed by his subordinates. What a defender of the poor. Fuck you and choke on your pennies, Sarah shouted and poured the dirty water from the bucket right on the boss's expensive shoes. She picked up her bag and threw her lab coat at the feet of the gawkers, who were delighted by what they saw, but carefully tried to hide it under the masks of condemnation of the rebellious cleaner. Everyone quietly hated their boss, but were afraid to say so. It wasn't until she was outside that Sarah was able to breathe freely. Now she knew where to go. Hello, convalescents, Sarah said cheerfully as she entered Jessica Smith's room. How are you doing? The sick women began to talk excitedly about their problems. Many had never been visited. Sarah wrote down their wishes in a notebook, promising to buy the little things they asked for. Hello, my savior, Jessica smiled. Why are you here in the middle of the workday? Got fired, the woman informed her. Fired how? Jessica Smith exclaimed. And for what? Frederick Ives scandalized me for helping you, replied Sarah. I told you he was a bad man, Jessica exclaimed heartily. She immediately stopped talking, realizing she had spoken out of turn. And how do you know my daughter, and how is she related to my boss? Sarah wanted an explanation. There was nothing to do. Jessica Smith had to come clean and tell everything about Frederick Ives, her son, and Sarah herself. Now you know everything, Jessica sighed. I didn't think you and I would meet like this. Emily wanted to introduce us herself. She and I are friends. She comes to visit me after school. We do homework, drink tea, and talk about stuff. So that's the grandmother she goes to, Sarah laughed. I thought she was visiting a friend. They have a grandmother there too. Thank you. My daughter is so much calmer and happier. I didn't even know she was looking for a fiancé. Her father left me when I was pregnant, and then he died in a drunken brawl. I can't say that. And you come see me after your discharge, Jessica Smith suggested. We'll stick together, help each other out. Speaking of help, some well-to-do acquaintances of mine need a maid. They pay well. Maybe you'd like to go. Sure. That would be nice, Sarah said excitedly. Then call this number. Jessica Smith wrote the numbers on a piece of notepaper. Tell them it's from me. Also take the keys to the house. I have a cat there. Oh, and Emily likes to play with it after school. Anyway, don't be shy. And Sarah left satisfied that she had such an acquaintance, and soon she had a job. Sarah began to put the house in order, and suddenly she came across Alexander's letter, where the mother tells him about the girl Emily, that she visits her after school. After a little thought, Sarah decided to end it by saying that Jessica Smith was now in the hospital. Sarah, Emily's mother, is looking after her. She sealed the letter and took it to the post office and sent it by registered mail so that it would reach the colony. Then she remembered the telephone number Jessica Smith had given her. She was welcome on the other end of the line and made an appointment for tomorrow in a wealthy part of town. When Sarah arrived at the address, she was amazed at the beauty of the building. The only thing that frightened her was the kind of people who lived there. The only rich man she met turned out to be a thief and a hypocrite. Therefore, stepping on the threshold of the house, Sarah inwardly prepared for the boorishness of the owners. But this did not happen. Hello, a pretty woman walked towards her. You've come at last. I can't cope with the household anymore. The thing is, we recently moved here, and the house is too big for me to clean by myself, and I have twin 1-year-old sons I can't eat, let alone scrub the floors. Make yourself at home. At your disposal everything you see. Any appliances, household chemicals, products. Don't be shy. Meals are on us. The fridge is full. If you will also prepare dinner for your husband's arrival, I'd be very grateful. And I'll pay, of course, Sarah said with a sigh of relief. And what is the fee for the month? When Sarah found out how much they were going to pay for household help as well, she was delighted. The amount was noticeably more than she was getting from Frederick. Thus began a new page in her life, and soon Jessica Smith was discharged from the hospital, and the house was ready for her arrival. Alex wrote a letter back to Sarah, where he was glad that such a kind woman was looking after his mother. After the first paycheck, her mother was able to buy Emily a dress and shoes, which she had been dreaming of for a long time. The girl's joy was unbounded. "Look what my mom bought me a dress." Flew into the room happy Emily and spun around in front of Jessica Smith. "Oh, it's so pretty." The latter splashed her hands. "You look like a princess in it." "Only there's something missing," and Jessica pulled a small pearl necklace out of the jewelry box. "Take it as a memento of me," she said quietly. "I never had a granddaughter, but you have. Wear it. Remember me, little girl, and lest you doubt that I gave you such a dear thing, I'll sign a card for you. It's New Year's Eve in 2 weeks, and this will be my present." A couple minutes later, Emily was showing off in a gorgeous pearl necklace with the cherished card in her hand. It seemed to her that all this splendor, the dress, the grandmother, the jewelry was not happening to her right now, but on the other side of town. Sarah, who was valued and respected at work, was happy. The young landlady was as hands-off without her, and the owner marveled at the home-cooked meals Sarah was preparing. Refusing to pay extra for cooking, she believed that she was already generously paid, and therefore did not want anything. Besides, Sarah had peace of mind about her daughter, who was under the sensitive care of Jessica Smith. One day, Sarah received a phone call. "Good evening," a pleasant male voice said into the receiver. "Is this Sarah?" "Yes, who is it?" she replied, slightly surprised. "My name is Alex. You wrote to me, remember?" he asked. "Hello, Alex, I completely forgot I gave you my number. Is something wrong?" "No, don't worry," he replied. "I had time for a call, so I thought I'd take advantage of the moment. I already called my mom. She and Emily are doing fine. How are you doing? After your former assistant Frederick kicked me out of my job, your mom helped me out a lot. Turns out there are some good rich people out there. They're very fond of me, and they pay me well. When I get out of jail, which will be pretty soon, I'll pay you back for the good," Alex said after a little silence. "What you're doing for my mom is priceless to me. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon and maybe become friends." The call cut off. Apparently, the prisoner's talking time was strictly limited. Sarah felt sorry for Alex. After all, he had suffered for nothing. She sighed and set about preparing dinner for the hosts and some important guests they had mentioned this time. Sarah decided to impress everyone with goose and apples. An appetizing aroma wafted throughout the house. When the host appeared on the doorstep with his future business partner, a painfully familiar voice sounded. "What a smell," I'm salivating. "What kind of sorceress is working in your kitchen?" "That's our assistant. She really has golden hands," boasted the owner. "My wife can't get enough of it." And then Sarah realized who the guest was. The porcelain cup fell out of her hand and shattered. "What happened?" Tess, the hostess, asked. "You didn't hurt yourself." Men came into the dining room. One of them blushed thickly when he saw Sarah. It was Frederick Ives. "Is this where you decided to confront me with this scoundrel?" she exclaimed. "I don't understand you," marveled the landlord. "What kind of reaction is that? Sarah is my wife's assistant. The whole house is on her, and you have something against that." "Yes," Sarah said. "That man is against all decent people. He kicked me out of my job just because I called a doctor for an elderly woman who wasn't feeling well." The homeowners stood frozen, horrified as they watched their guest attack the innocent housekeeper. However, they did not stop attacking, apparently fearing to offend an important business partner on whom their welfare depended. But they didn't want to lose such a good employee either. Sarah understood that. "You disobeyed me," Frederick yelled. "You meddled in the wrong business. Throw her out now." "All you can do is kick her out," Sarah grinned. "Don't bother. I'll leave on my own." "And don't yell, you idiot. You're scaring the kids. Thanks to this house, I'll go to the other one." And she walked resolutely out of the kitchen. The landlady ran after her, apologizing for not being able to keep Sarah working here. She had paid a generous retreat, enough for her and her children to live comfortably for several months. The whole unpleasant story had knocked Sarah out of her mind. Angry tears poured down her cheeks and froze in the cold. How lucky she was to have such a friend and advocate as Jessica Smith. She calmed down, remembering her, and picked up her pace. The entrance to Jessica Smith's house was visible in the snow, and to open the doors, Sarah had to get a shovel from the shed and shovel the path and porch. That's odd, she thought. Jessica Smith hadn't left the house since yesterday. That didn't sound like her. The house was dark and stuffy. So after opening the curtains and letting the rays of morning light into the room, Sarah made her way to the older woman's bedroom. "Jessica Smith, are you home?" Sarah asked, but no one answered. She was beginning to worry, but where could an avid homebody go? Sarah walked into the bedroom and saw something that made her heart clench with unbearable pain. A scream ripped from her chest. A shiver ran through her body as if she had been electrocuted. Jessica Smith lay in bed with her eyes open. She was dead. In her hand was a crumpled piece of paper. "Jessica Smith! How could it be?" Sarah screamed, and tears hailed from her eyes. Grief was choking her, gripping her throat. "How could it be, my good girl? Everything was fine. What can we do? What about Alex, your son, who was supposed to be back soon, and Emily loves you so much?" Sarah sobbed over the body of a woman she didn't recognize as her mother. An ambulance was called to transport the deceased to the morgue, and Sarah stayed at Jessica Smith's house. She looked around. Everything was just as it had been when the landlady was alive. Suddenly, a piece of paper lying on the bed caught her attention. Sarah picked it up and with a sinking heart began to read. Terror seized her. The letter was from the colony. It said that Alex had been crushed by a log while logging and had died. "So that's what caused it," Sarah exclaimed. Alex had died, and Jessica Smith, upon learning of her son's death, couldn't handle the grief. She cleaned up and went to prepare dinner for Emily, who was about to arrive. Sarah's cooking was automatic, subconsciously wanting to breathe life into this house. It was what Jessica Smith would have wanted, and she had decided to stay here until the heirs were found. It was too miserable to let go of the beautiful winter garden that the owner had grown with so much love, and the cat needed care. It was as if he sensed the trouble in the air, and was always near Sarah, as if looking to her for support. "I'm here." Emily stood on the doorstep, shaking off her snowcap. "Oh, Mom, what are you doing here?" Not at work. Sarah didn't know how to tell her daughter that her Aunt Jessica was gone. She stood there sobbing silently. Emily suddenly ran into the living room and then, smelling food in the kitchen, asked bluntly, "What? Is she in the hospital?" And seeing her mom waggle her head negatively through her tears, she asked, "Is she dead?" The baby's sorrowful crying filled the house. The little girl had faced heavy grief too soon. Her mother hugged her and quietly reassured her. "That's life. Emily, everyone has their time." Jessica Smith would have been happy if she had known that those who loved her were grieving for her. She didn't die alone. She had us when she had calmed down a little. Her mother suggested that she stay at Jessica Smith's house. The girl accepted. About Alex's death to her daughter, she did not say anything, fearing for the fragile psyche of the child. It was good that Emily always had a cat by her side to comfort her. Turning around, the prison doctor said to Alex, "Lucky you, Smith, the log hit you tangentially. Your namesake wasn't so lucky. He took his breath away, yay." "Lucky," Alex said. "My arm still hurts." "That's why I'm here." The doctor scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. "That call came from someone named Sarah. She's demanding to release your body for burial." "What?" Alex wondered. "You'll have to excuse me, but our secretary got it all mixed up and buried another Alex instead of one Alex, sending the funeral to the wrong family," said the doctor. "My mother will go crazy with grief," Alex shouted. "Call and cancel this circus." That was the point. Alex was called. The doctor fell silent. "Your mother passed away yesterday." "I'm sorry to hear that. What do you mean?" Alex staggered back. The realization that in an instant he had become an orphan hamstrung his legs, taking away all his strength. His head spun with the horrible news. He never said another word. And in the evening he escaped from the infirmary, hiding in a box of dirty linen, which was taken to the laundry by the prison machine. Once free, escaped convict Alex Sokolovsky got some clothes and traveled back to his hometown. He wanted to make it to his mother's funeral. Jessica Smith's burial was modest. There were few people at the funeral itself, including Sarah, who had organized everything out of the money her landlady had given her. Sarah stood silently by the fresh grave and wept. She felt sorry for Aunt Jessica, who had done so much for her. When everyone had gone, Emily placed a small snowman on the mound of earth, like the one she kept in the freezer at home. "She'll have more fun that way," Emily explained. "Mom, Aunt Jessica will know we love her." Sarah didn't argue. By this time, Alex was on his way into town. He avoided crowded places because he knew very well that he was immediately wanted. Alex didn't feel any cold. He was burning with unbearable pain for his mother, whom he was not allowed to say goodbye to. The burning hatred for the one who had put him in prison gave him strength. Alex walked from the outskirts of the city to his home, hiding from patrol cars in dark back alleys and yards. And finally, he saw a nice garden with a low fence and a house so dear beloved, where his mother was no longer there. This thought burned him like a red-hot iron. Only now, seeing his childhood home, he fully realized what grief had befallen him. Tears streamed down his face. "Mom, no one will ever ask again, Alex, son, how are you doing? Are you hungry?" The light was on in the house. Alex didn't dare go in. He was afraid it was an ambush. He would be arrested and returned to prison. However, he was tormented by the unknown. He didn't know when and where Jessica Smith would be buried, so he decided to wait. An hour later, a girl of about 9 years old came out of the house. Alex was surprised. He had never seen this child near her mother. Trying to get a better look at the little guest, he reached out and pushed aside a branch. The snow from his hat fell directly on his head and over his scruff. The cold burned the skin on the back of his neck. Alex let out a little gasp, and it was enough to reach the child's keen hearing. She turned in the direction of the noise and spotted a man behind a tree, who froze fearfully in anticipation. "Uncle, who are you?" Emily, to Alex's surprise, wasn't scared at all. On the contrary, stepped towards him. "My name is Alex. I used to live in this house," he whispered. "So you're Uncle Alex," Emily smiled. "So you're Aunt Jessica's son." "And I'm Emily." Alex was surprised at the unfamiliar little girl's awareness. "And how do you know my mom?" he asked. "I used to visit her, and then my mom started being friends with her." When the girl mentioned death, he stammered, and his lips quivered. "Mom and I stayed here to take care of the house and the cats until the new owners came, and here you've come. Let's go home." Kids, that simple question hit Alex like a shoe on the head. It had been so long since anyone had called him to eat or called him Alex. "No, I can't. I have to get to my mom's funeral on time," he said. "Oh," the girl said, "we buried her yesterday." Alex was hit with a suffocating wave of regret for not having time to say goodbye to his mother. Falling to his knees, he covered his face with his hands and sobbed. Emily ran up to him and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. "Don't cry." Aunt Jessica didn't like crying. Emily was cheerful and, stroking his head, added, "Go to the cemetery. You'll recognize her grave at once. Mom decorated it with a big bouquet of red roses. And there's my snowman, just like this one." And she pointed to a big snowman with a carrot instead of a nose. "We made it together." Alex looked at the snowman. He used to make those with his mom, too. Anger at the culprit of all this trouble boiled up in his chest. "Thank you, Emily," he said. "You've been a great help to me. Yes, I'll visit my mom's grave and whoever is responsible. I promise he'll be in a lot of trouble. He'll answer for everything." Having hugged Emily goodbye, Alex took confident steps in not hiding much anymore and went to Frederick's office in New York, the very office that knew Jafai, the very office that had been so unfairly taken from him. No, he wasn't sorry for the stolen company or his millionaire status. He was infinitely sorry for the lost years he had spent away from his mother, who had died of grief. "And he should have been buried so soon," Emily said businesslike, taking off her boots. Uncle Alex got upset and went to deal with the uncle who's to blame for everything. He's definitely going to be in trouble. "Who got upset?" Sarah's hands shook with shock. "Uncle Alex," Emily explained calmly. "First he got scared when he saw me, then he cried, and then for some reason he got really angry and went off somewhere." "Look at this picture." Sarah showed a framed picture of Alex, taking it from the mantel. "Is that him?" "Yes," Emily said, "only he's younger here." "So he's not dead," Sarah exclaimed. "So Jessica Smith got the wrong information. My goodness, I think I know what he's up to. We've got to warn Frederick." Sarah didn't really care about Frederick and his safety. She felt sorry for Alex, who could have gotten himself into trouble and gone to jail for more time. So this was a mistake she had to correct for the sake of Jessica Smith's memory. "Frederick Ives," she shouted into the phone. "It's Sarah." "You again," he replied grudgingly. "What do you want?" "He's coming." "Alex is coming to see you." "How?" yelled Frederick fearfully. "Did they let him out?" Without answering, Sarah was already running to her former office to prevent tragedy. There was no telling what Alex was prepared to do in his state of shock. But she wasn't in time. Alex was already in the lobby, where the staff looked at him, dressed in an old jacket and jeans, with bewilderment. The guard was new and didn't know the firm's former director, and so Alex wasn't let through. "Who are you here to see?" the older security guard asked. "I need to see Frederick Ives, but on a personal matter," Alex replied discreetly. Making a sign to wait, the guard called his superior. "Frederick Ives, you have a visitor," said it's a personal matter. When Frederick realized who had come to see him, he panicked. He opened the safe and began frantically going through documents. He pulled out a thick folder, opened it, and began flipping through the papers as if they were where his salvation lay. At that minute, Frederick heard the elevator on his floor open. Then, frightened that it was coming for him, he rushed out of his office and into the security room, forgetting to lock the safe and put away the secret folder. On the way, he almost ran into Sarah, who stepped out of the elevator and headed for the receptionist's office. She entered the office and, assessing the mess, realized Frederick had chickened out and escaped, which meant Alex was already here. They'd just missed each other. A bright yellow folder labeled for official use caught Sarah's eye. She opened it and realized from the first lines that it was evidence against Frederick. It contained all the documents proving the machinations of the criminal scheme Ives had used to take the company away from Alex and put him on trial. Carefully photographing each sheet on her phone, she tucked the valuable gadget into the inside pocket of her jacket. After all, it could save Alex from jail. Now it was just a matter of finding him. The perpetrator of the commotion did not wait for the police to arrive, but walked out of the office with a quick step, trying not to attract the attention of visitors. Now he wanted to go to his mother's grave. The way to the cemetery lay across a small lake, but no sooner had he crossed the bridge than he heard desperate sounds and screaming. A boy was choking and screaming. He had fallen through the ice and was drowning. There was no time to think. "Hey, kid," shouted Alex on the run. "I'm coming. You hear me. Hang on." Unwinding the scarf, he held it out to the boy and cautiously crawled to the edge of the ice hole. The boy grabbed the end of the scarf, carefully pulling him toward him. Alex tugged the boy out of the hole with a jerk. "Thank you," the boy whispered through gritted teeth. "You got it," Alex smiled. He was glad he'd saved the man's life. Then it hadn't all been for nothing. "Let me wrap you up in my jacket. Are you from the village?" The boy nodded. Alex ran that way, and a police car with a siren was already chasing him. He stopped. The child's life was more precious than his own freedom. The policeman got out of the car and, correctly assessing the situation, put Alex, who was holding the boy to himself to keep him warm, in the cabin, and then rushed to the village straight after the paramedic. For the courage shown during the rescue of the child, as well as taking into account the special reasons that prompted the escape, it is decided to pardon Alex Sokolovsky and not to punish him for escaping from the colony, read the warden. The court ruling. "Well, Alex, you're our hero. You're still lucky. What a beautiful woman came to see you today. You can go on your date. You have 2 hours." Intrigued, Alex walked out of the boss's office and headed for the dating room. There he saw Sarah. "I'm sorry, but I don't know you." "There must be some kind of mistake," Alex said. "But I know an absentia from your mom and my daughter, so we know each other." "I've texted you," she smiled. "So you are the Sarah," Alex rejoiced. "Thank you for coming." Sarah could see that Alex was easy to talk to, a nice person just like his mother. When she showed the photo of the documents, she realized she had done the right thing. Alex was just shaking with joy. "What a smart girl you are. Please, let's hire a lawyer. The money is lying around the house. They're hidden in the cat's jar. You'll see everything will be fine." "So how are you living?" "I wish Jessica Smith had lived to see this day," Sarah lamented. "Also, I almost threw that old Ken away yesterday. The cat wouldn't let me because he's smart," Alex laughed. "How's Emily doing?" "Here sent you all her candy. Said you ran away hungry. I brought you some cutlets and pies. Eat up, and you're so thin." Alex was pleased with such care. His heart slowly began to thaw, freeing itself from evil. That's what happens when a person has hope. The lawyer got his case reconsidered, presenting new evidence of his client's innocence. The court took into account all the arguments and restored Alex in the rights of the president of the company, also obliging Frederick, New York, to pay all lost profits, as well as moral damage in the form of compensation for the lost years of life in prison and mental suffering. Frederick himself went to the colony on a full program. When the prison gates closed behind Alex's back, he felt the warm May breeze. It was the wind of freedom. Alex turned around and saw Sarah, who was holding Emily's hand. The girl was wearing a simple dress, and her mother's family necklace adorned her thin neck. He realized this was his mother letting him know that they were family now. Emily snatched her hand out of her mother's grasp and ran to Alex, squatting down. Alex pulled her against him, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. "You wouldn't happen to be my daddy, would you?" she whispered in his ear. "I've been waiting for you so long."
"If you want me to be, I will be," Alex replied.
He took her in his arms and walked towards Sarah, "My daughter, and I have decided to become a family here." "Seriously," Alex said. "Are you okay with us?" Sarah smiled. "Of course I'm in." Sarah returned to her former office already as manager and wife of the head of the company. The honest employees were delighted with the change in leadership, and those who had stood idly by and indulged when Frederick bullied Sarah and Alex's mother were immediately fired. The company was set on a course of growth and prosperity, led by an experienced executive. Jessica was given a beautiful monument in the form of an angel made of white marble. Next to a vase full of fresh flowers stood a small homemade snowman that Emily had made. The girl was still grieving for her favorite aunt. Together with Alex, they often visited the grave. When Alex and Emily were returning home, the father asked his daughter, "What if you get a baby sister? How do you look at that?" "I'm looking good," clapped Emily's hands together. "I even know what we're going to name her." "And what's that?" "Jessica. It's such a flower."